For marrying the useless man whose spiritual palace is broken. Author, Threa de Chengjing. Copywriting, due to the fall of the head of the Huo family, Huo Ju, the talented son of the head of the family, was shattered and turned into a useless person, and the Huo family fell overnight. The Mu family, who wanted to marry the Huo family at the beginning, had no way out because the heads of the two families who had a good relationship in the past swore a hard oath, and the way of heaven witnessed it. The wedding was held as scheduled, and although the vow could not be violated, the oath did not specify who the oath was, so the Mu family replaced the young lady of the Mu family with Mu Qinglan, a small fish in the family, packed up and married Ling Ling. Huo Ju, the useless man whose government has collapsed. The new bride has changed, and she was also planted with puppet voodoo. Huo Ju knew about the fact that the Mu family tried to let her steal the Huo family's top-grade magic weapon before he even lifted his hijab. 1 month into their marriage, the little puppet sneaked into Huo Ju's room in the middle of the night, and impatiently moved to Huo Ju's bedside. What Huo Ju was waiting for was for the puppet of the Mu family to show his true colors. Lying on the bed and breathing slowly, his subordinates were all outside the door. As long as the puppet dared to touch the spiritual weapon on his neck, he would be taken down on the spot. Unexpectedly, the puppet approached Huo Ju, half-kneeled by the bed, held his breath, lowered his head to follow Huo Ju's hand that was placed in front of him, and kissed his fingertips warmly. Then he got up, jumped 3 times on the spot, and then danced silently in the room like a madman. Huo Ju. The subordinates waiting outside the door. Mu Qinglan, the person who will be married is my male god. Is there such a good thing in this world? Our girls must get what they want. Number as the saying goes, making objects cure all diseases. The girl who has been secretly in love for many years and has worked hard to be an idiot versus the man who was accidentally melted into a puddle of spring water and ice sculpture. Read the guide humming, chirping, daily writing about love. There is no grandiose plot. This book is about women chasing men, the mudslide type. Don't force yourself if it's not good. The background setting of this book is a continuation of Why Is This Little Brother Like This?, but the stories are independent and do not affect each other. If it is replaced by a real person, it will be deleted when it is seen. The setting of self-cultivation bases, entering delusion, fitness, breaking delusion, permanent appearance, escape from the world, up to 250 years old, 500 years old in the midterm, and 1000 years old at the peak. Cocoon soul, you can descend at will, his body, spiritual union, together with heaven and earth, magic repair setting, sharpening, obsessed, destroying soul, in the middle of the devil, and violent spirit, the big devil, are divided into front, middle, and peak 3 realms. January 31, 2022. Screenshot has been taken. Content tags, a match made in heaven. Search keywords, protagonist, Mu Qinglan supporting role, Huo Ju others. 1 sentence introduction, as the saying goes, falling in love cures all diseases. Conception, never forget, there must be echo. The Tianyuan sword sect and the Mu family of the Baisong Kingdom's fairy clan got married according to the vows made by the 2 patriarchs back then. But everyone knows that Huo Ju, the young leader of the Tianyuan sword sect, is already a useless man with a broken spiritual palace. Marrying a with a broken spiritual palace is not even as good as marrying a mortal farmer Orion. After the spiritual mansion of a cultivator is broken, what awaits is the 5 declines of heaven and man. If the spiritual power dissipated faster, the bride might be received by the bridegroom, and the groom is still a young man, and the groom might be very old when Xiainiu sends the bride to Baisong Mountain. The Mu family is not stupid either. Although the Tianyuan sword sect is one of the 4 major sects in the cultivation world, the elders of the inner sect will be separated in the building. The eldest miss of the Mu family refused to marry because of her life and death, so the Mu family had a bad idea. Witnessed by the Dao of heaven, the oath cannot be disobeyed, otherwise you will be burdened by karma, but this oath does not refer to anyone in particular. As long as the one who gets married is from the Mu family, that's fine. Therefore, the newlyweds in this sedan chair were not at all the eldest miss of the Mu family, Mu Wanran, who had sworn to be fulfilled. It's a side branch of the Mu family that can't be reached by 8 poles, a small trash fish that is not on the table in the Mu family Mu Kinglan. The Mu family detained the blind mother of the new bride, Mu Kinglan, under the pretense of treating her mother's illness, in order to intimidate her, and forced her to put her on the bridal sedan chair. It's really pitiful. Along the way, the newlyweds did not eat or drink or get out of the car, obviously extremely disheartened. However, it is completely different from the shabby welcoming procession, such as the morning procession. The newlyweds in the sedan chair are all dressed up all the way, with pink cheeks and pink cheeks under the hijab, red lips and white teeth, and the corners of their eyes and brows are full of joy that anyone who takes a look at will laugh along with them. The corners of a pair of lips are almost hooked to the base of the ears. From the moment she was imprisoned into the sedan chair, she has been on the journey for 3.5 days, including sleeping, and the corner of the bride's mouth has never been pressed down. If it weren't for the fear that others would think she was crazy if she laughed out loud, Mu Kinglan really wanted to laugh out loud. The person she married was her male god. Is there such a good thing in this world? She reached out and smashed the wedding car, very lightly, with anger. This ox cart is really too slow. It's been 3.5 days, and she hasn't arrived yet. She can't wait to get rid of the wedding car and run to Baisong Mountain by herself, so that she can meet her groom as soon as possible. Thinking of Huoju, who went to Mu's house to attend the Mu family's patriarch's birthday banquet, it was 10 years ago. Huoju was sitting in the main hall with an épée on his back. Mu Kinglan couldn't enter the banquet hall at the beginning, so she had to pretend to be a maidservant, and poured wine by his side cloth dish. The boy's eyebrows were flying, but his temperament was calm. His face was like an ice sculpture and snow sculpture. He didn't touch anything during the banquet, but sitting there was pleasing to the eye like a white jade statue. He even looked back at her. That glance made Mu Kinglan haunt her dreams. Mu Kinglan was lost in memory. The smile on the corner of her mouth widened a bit, and she let out a soft laugh with a hey. The little girl jumped up and down, covered her face with her hands, and manually smoothed the corners of her forgetful mouth. Rubbing her face, she raised her hijab a little, pressed her heart with one hand, and told herself to be dignified and gentle, just like she had to pretend to be reluctant before getting into the wedding car. Then slowly stretched out her slender fingers, opened the window of the wedding car a little bit, and looked up at Baisong Mountain. The large formation of Baisong Mountain is like Balian holding the waves of the sky, isolating the extreme cold of the wind and snow, and isolating everything on the other side of the world. Seen from a distance, the big formation that embraces the wind and snow looks like a large cumulonimbus cloud, with a sense of magnificence and oppression like black clouds overwhelming the city. Sword repairers have always been good at hard work, and only hard work can make sword repairers unite body and sword under extreme circumstances, enlighten their hearts, and eventually become spiritual shields. Therefore, all the sword cultivators who come out of Baisong Mountain have the cold smell of frost and snow on their bodies, but Mu Kinglan feels that Huoju is different. His smell is very special. Mu Kinglan can't describe how special it is. Anyway, it makes people want to hug him and rub him. Of course, when you like someone, he is unique in your eyes. For the rest of the journey, Mu Kinglan entered the formation at Baisong Mountain with the good mood of marrying her sweetheart immediately. The cold wind and snow rolled into the wedding car along the gap of the carriage, and the pervasive cold made the disciples outside the carriage unbearable, and began to add clothes. But Mu Kinglan, who was only wearing a thin wedding dress, seemed to have no feelings at all. "Miss Mu, we've entered Baisong Mountain. The wind and snow are cold, so add some clothes. After walking for about a day, you will arrive at the Tianyuan sword sect. It will be fine when you enter the mountain. There are barriers in the sword sect. Great formation." The attendant knocked on the car door, and stuffed in a fox fur cloak. Mu Kinglan didn't say a word. She pulled the cloak inside, but didn't put it on herself. She is not cold at all, she is full of blood. The closer she was to the mountain, the more she couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to actually meet Huoju. What expression would Huoju use to face her? I heard that he lost his eyesight, so if he touches her face, he can imagine her appearance, right? She admits that she is no uglier than the young lady of the Mu family, Mu Wanran. Mu Qinglan was very nervous, biting the back of her hand anxiously and expectantly. After all, she is not the eldest lady of the Mu family. Although the two families are tacit understanding, will Huoju dislike her? What should I do if I don't like her and refuse to share the bed with her? It's not okay to sleep in different beds. She even thought of the name of the two of their children. She finally got the Mu family to choose her to marry. Is it easy to find a mother who is blind and can be threatened? Mu Qinglan suffered anxiously and sweetly for a day and a half, and finally arrived at Baisong Mountain Tianyuan Sword School. The wedding car entered slowly. It was already the 5th day of marriage, and it was getting dark. Mu Qinglan was thinking in the wedding car, it's so late, isn't it a bit late for Bai Tiandi to re-enter the bridal chamber? She always has to take care of Huoju's current body, will he get sick after all this trouble? The wild animal finally stopped, and Mu Qinglan's nerves were as tense as a string. She waited for Huoju to pick her up to pay her respects, but she waited and waited, but she never heard anyone coming from outside. The person who notified should have notified Huoju as soon as they entered the mountain. It shouldn't take so long. It really shouldn't be so long. Huoju had already received the news that the bride had arrived. But in the entire Baisong Mountain, except for the wedding car, there was no joy at all, not even a piece of red silk was hung. Huoju was sitting in a wheelchair at the moment, in his own room, fiddling with a crossbow in his hand. His eyes were covered with pure white tulle, and his beautiful lips under the bridge of his handsome nose were light in color. Even though there was a stove not far in front of him, he still felt a chill creeping towards his bones. He was very thin, and he was wearing a snow-colored fox fur, which made him look even weaker. His long black hair was half scattered on his shoulders, his face was pale, like a snowman, as if he was about to melt into the house at any time, and he had long since disappeared. That high-spirited appearance of the leader of the fairy sect. His spiritual mansion is like a bamboo basket with water leaking from all sides, unable to mobilize any spiritual energy at all, and the fatigue caused by the 5 declines of heaven and man makes it very hard for him to even sit. He frowned slightly, and listened to someone entering the door. Outside the door was one of Huoju's only remaining subordinates, named Chu Shuang, and Chu Shuang came to report, "Young master, the wedding car has arrived." Huoju was unmoved. He didn't look like a newlywed groom at all. He was dressed in plain white, almost wearing black and white. Hearing this, he just paused his hands, then tilted his head slightly and ordered, "Place it in Sushuan Pavilion. Don't set up a restriction, give her a secret order to go down the mountain." Huoju said, "If she wants to run, no matter what she brings in the hall, don't stop her, give her the medicine to suppress the puppet goo, and let her go." The Mu family broke their promises and sent such a person here. Huoju was not prepared to treat each other like a husband and wife. They were not the marriage candidates in the oath at all. Not only did he know that the woman got into the wedding car because her mother was captured by the Mu family, he also knew other things. The newlywed was planted with a puppet voodoo, and Huoju knew about the fact that the Mu family tried to let her steal the Huo family's top Kaladi magic weapon from the moment she got into the wedding car. She was only at the initial stage of entering the realm of delusion, and she was unable to fast at the beginning of entering the realm of delusion. She could not eat or move along the way, which was obviously controlled by people. In Sushuan Pavilion, he set up a magic circle, which can suppress the attack of the puppet goo. As long as she stays obediently for a few days, the goo insects will be inactivated, and then take the medicine, they will naturally be able to completely suppress the goo insects. Puppet goo has a lifespan, and the medicine he prepared for her to suppress the goo worm is enough to survive until the goo worm in her body dies. Huoju asked himself that he had exhausted his benevolence. When Chu Shuang heard that he didn't even have the desire to pick up the bride, he also sighed deeply in his heart, the young master is really so pitiful. Since the sudden death of the head, the sect fell apart overnight, the young head's spiritual mansion was shattered, and because of the inversion of the Pluto Sea, the servants in the door sneaked away and were left unattended, and were almost pulled into the magic cave. But was blinded by the magic energy. It happened that the Mu family broke their promise when the young head needed help the most, and sent a side branch girl who was only in the early stage of delusion to marry. It is really hateful. However, the young master is kind-hearted, and if he does not follow the chapel, it is not considered a marriage. This woman is wise enough to take the antidote and leave, and if she remarries in the future, it will not be regarded as a delay. Chu Shuang took the order, turned around and went out to settle the bride. Poor Mu Qinglan, waiting for her lover with a surge of heart, but in the end, she didn't come at all. The little disciple who came there called himself Chu Shuang, and said, "The young master said that Miss Mu must be extremely exhausted after traveling far away, let my subordinates Miss Mu to Sushuan Pavilion to rest first." After hearing this statement in the wedding car, Mu Qinglan quit immediately. She felt sorry for Huoju's poor health, so she could save all the complicated etiquette in the middle, but she heard what Huoju meant, and she wanted to regret the marriage. How can this work? She is here. When Mu Qinglan was in a hurry, her eyes turned green like mist, and she blurted out in a sharp voice, "No." After Mu Qinglan shouted, she immediately realized that she had lost her composure, and the strangeness in her eyes faded away in an instant. Outside, Chu Shuang said again, "Young sect master has been suffering from cold recently, and he is ill and unable to respond to things, and there are many things that are not well thought out. I will never forget Miss Mu Hai Han." When Mu Qinglan heard that Huoju was ill, she couldn't care less about being afraid that Huoju was just making excuses and trying to regret the marriage. The person who had not moved in the carriage for several days along the way couldn't help but lifted the curtain and jumped out. Like a ray of breeze, he fell lightly in front of Chu Shuang and asked eagerly, "Huo, how is Huo Lang? I'll go see him." Mu Qinglan said, "Lead me the way." Chu Shuang hurriedly took a step back, but she didn't expect Miss Mu to get out of the car suddenly, and she was very shocked. But things have come to this point, the young head is not willing to come to welcome the bride, let alone hold a wedding and marry this Miss Mu, so he can only bite the bullet and prevaricate it first. Chu Shuang said, "The young master has already fallen asleep." Mu Qinglan, who was about to leave, paused and stood still not far from Chu Shuang. No matter how much she likes Huoju, she is not stupid. This huge Tianyuan sword sect has traveled all the way, and there is not even a piece of festive red silk outside. Become a white lantern at the time of death. Huoju wanted to regret the marriage, knowing that she was not the eldest lady of the Mu family, he did not intend to marry her. Mu Qinglan was dressed in a wedding dress, and the red hijab was not even lifted. Standing there, she suddenly became silent, her whole body became cold, the night wind blew past, and the cedar trees in the courtyard were cast into shadows by the ever-burning lights. Chu Shuang and some accompanying disciples felt the coldness, and one of the disciples couldn't help but rub the fine hair on his arm. It stands to reason that the large formation in this sect is enough to isolate the wind and snow, and the seasons change in the same way as in the mountain. Only the place where the disciples practice is covered with snow all year round, and the temperature should not suddenly drop suddenly. Besides, practitioners are seldom affected by changes in temperature, unless it is the severe cold outside the big formation, but it is really strange that the coldness hits people's spine at this moment. However, before Chu Shuang could feel where the coldness came from, whether there was something wrong with the big formation, the coldness suddenly dissipated without a sound. Mu Qinglan spoke in a low voice, with anger, "But I haven't lifted my hijab yet." After hearing Mu Qinglan's words, the surrounding disciples couldn't help but feel pity. Chu Shuang's lips moved, trying to persuade him, but in the end he remained silent. Mu Qinglan has already smiled under the hijab again, Her expression can be called doting. What can she do? Of course he chose to forgive him, who made him Huoju. Anyway, she has already entered the Tianyuan sword sect. Anyway, everyone knows that she is Huoju's wife. She has a bright future, so she is not in a hurry. Mu Qinglan was led by Chu Shuang and placed in Sushuan Pavilion, where there was a formation set up by Huoju. Mu Qinglan could see it clearly as soon as she entered. So it is. Huoju knew that she was planted as a puppet by the Huo family, and thought she was a puppet controlled by gu worms. He thought that she didn't marry her voluntarily, so he would not marry her, and even helped her set up a battle to suppress the gu worms. Mu Qinglan was extremely beautiful in her heart. Even if her fairy house was broken, she would still be such a gentleman who would not force others to make things difficult for her. She was taken to sleep by the maid who accompanied her, and when she thought of seeing Huo Lang tomorrow, she was laughing in her dreams. On the other hand, Huoju didn't fall asleep even late at night. Chu Shuang settled Mu Qinglan, and came back to report to Huoju. Huoju just responded lightly, sitting in front of the charcoal stove with his hands on his knees, motionless and silent, looks like a piece of dead wood. Chu Shuang is Huoju's younger brother. She grew up with him and has seen Huoju's most beautiful appearance. When she saw him again, she felt that her eyes were sore. He felt that Huoju was now like a charcoal fire in a charcoal furnace, simmering the last of his vitality, and when the warmth dissipated, he was burned to remove a layer of floating ash and a layer of vitality. Wait until the heat burns out. Chu Shuang didn't dare to think any more, and couldn't help persuading, Sect Master, it's getting late, let's rest. Huoju just tilted his head slightly when he heard the words. His eyes were blind, but he still habitually followed the source of the sound to look at people. But halfway through turning his head, he stopped. She moved her pale lips and said, "Go and rest first." Chu Shuang knew that it would be useless to talk about it any further. Sword cultivators were always stubborn and tenacious. As the leader of the younger generation in Baisongshan, Huoju was naturally very stubborn. Chu Shuang had no choice but to leave the door. Instead of going to rest, she just meditated outside the door, guarding Huoju. Huoju didn't go to bed very late because of the 5 declines. When Mu Qinglan came to find him the next day, Huoju had just got up. "Who's here?" Huoju's blindfolded white gauze fell on his neck overnight, and he opened a pair of grey eyes, looking in the direction of Chu Shuang. Chu Shuang said, "Miss Mu is here and wants to meet the young master." "No." Huoju's tone was cold. At the same time, he reached out and touched the pendant hanging around his neck. The pendant was round, like a piece of crystal clear jade, but if you looked closely, you would find that it was an exquisite mustard space. The mountains and rivers inside are fully visible, and it is the only remaining magic weapon of the Tianyuan sword sect in Baisong Mountain Rebirth Pond. Huoju already knew that the Mu family had the desire to seize the magic weapon, and Mu Qinglan was bewitched by a puppet, so she rushed to his side in such a hurry, presumably to try to get the magic weapon. The formation formed by Huoju to suppress the puppet gu will only take effect after a few days, and it will be effective if you don't leave Sushuan Pavilion during this period. He has already left an escape route for this Miss Mu, and now she is controlled by the puppet gu and cannot control herself, so he naturally refuses to see her. "Let her stay in her yard and don't run around," Huoju said again. Mu Qinglan was stopped by the formation outside Huoju's courtyard. Chu Shuang came out and explained to Mu Qinglan in a low voice. "The young master is not feeling well, and he had a late rest last night, and he hasn't got up yet. Miss Mu, you should go back first." Mu Qinglan twitched her eyebrows slightly when she heard the words, seeing that Chu Shuang didn't expose his lies. When her wedding car arrived last night, Chu Shuang said that Huoju was asleep. How long was it dark? Now it is said that Huoju slept late last night. This little disciple can't even tell a lie. Mu Qinglan was still wearing that wedding dress, but she took off the overly heavy shawl, which didn't look exaggerated, but in the Tianyuan sword sect where the disciples were all dressed in plain white, they were still eye-catching, like a put the fire that fell on the snow. Mu Qinglan stood outside the formation, with a bright smile on her face, listening to Chu Shuang inside the formation trying to prevaricate her. "Miss Mu, the young master hopes that you stay in Sushuan Pavilion and don't wander around. The door is now in a mess, and the royal guards are stationed in the sect. It will be bad if someone who doesn't have a good eye bumps into Miss Mu." Mu Qinglan knew that Huoju was awake, so she was not surprised even if she refused to see her. After all, she is a little fish sent by the Mu family to marry her. In a sense, she is a humiliation to Huoju. Coupled with the matter of the puppet voodoo, it is reasonable for Huoju to guard against her. But will she just give up? Of course not. No wolf will lie down obediently when the meat and bones can be seen. Mu Qinglan's eyes were crooked when she smiled, like two crescent moons with hooks. She looked at Chu Shuang, and she didn't show resignation, nor did she try to break through. Walking back and forth outside the formation, he looked back at the guards stationed by the royal family. Those guards were all like dead objects, all in pitch black, wearing full face masks, like a group of ominous black crows. Can these people collide with her? Mu Qinglan was a little annoyed, but this annoyance was different from real anger, scratching her heart like little claws. She wants to see her Huo Lang. Chu Shuang watched Mu Qinglan circle around and then stood still behind the formation like a water curtain. Mu Qinglan quickly smiled brightly like spring flowers on her face, and asked Chu Shuang softly, "Little brother, have you been by Huo Lang's side all the time?" Chu Shuang's expression paused, and his eyes were a little wary. After all, the seemingly gentle and harmless Miss Mu in front of her is a puppet sent by the Mu family. But Chu Shuang still replied very politely, "Ms. Mu is polite, just call me Chu Shuang. I really stay by the young master's side day and night, and I am at the disposal of the young master at any time." Mu Qinglan ignored his vigilance, stared straight at him and asked, "I don't know what kind of spirit house is this little brother?" Chu Shuang frowned slightly, not knowing why Mu Qinglan asked this. This time I answered briefly, "Mu Ling Mansion, what is Miss Mu asking this for?" "It's nothing," Mu Qinglan said, "I just think that the little brother is handsome, and he must be a leader in the school. I don't know what level the little brother is now. Has he escaped from the world?" Chu Shuang is not good at dealing with women, and Jian Qiu is not a smooth-faced person at all. While cultivating hard, he also uses all his mind to fight against the severe cold, going straight and not making detours. So Mu Qinglan spoke softly, pretending to be curious, and questioned Chu Shuang thoroughly with a few words. Then she really didn't embarrass Chu Shuang anymore. She went back to Sushuan Pavilion honestly and never came out again. For 2 days in a row, Chu Shuang reported to Huoju that Mu Qinglan was sitting by the window of the main room in Sushuan Pavilion and meditating. Huoju thought that the formation to suppress the puppet goo had worked, and ordered Chu Shuang, "When her puppet goo is suppressed and regains consciousness, you can give her the medicine to suppress the puppet worm and send her down the mountain." Chu Shuang was squatting next to Huoju's wheelchair, fiddling with charcoal fire. Hearing the words, he let out a casual "oh," but his round eyes did not look at the stove, but stared straight at Huoju who was close at hand. Staring at his handsome eyebrows, knife-cut sideburns, the white gauze covering his eyes, and his pale lips. "Hey!" Although Huoju was blind and his spiritual mansion was shattered, his spiritual power dissipated very slowly because of the superb magic weapon on him. Even though his spiritual power is no longer available for him to use, his 5 senses are still sharper than ordinary people. He could feel Chu Shuang looking at him. "What?" Huoju asked again. He turned his face to Chu Shuang's direction, waiting for Chu Shuang to speak. But soon Huoju was startled, and subconsciously leaned against the chair behind him. Chu Shuang grabbed his ankle. Because Huoju couldn't walk anymore, and he didn't like people to be close to him, for convenience, he usually didn't need others to put on his boots for him, but only covered his knees with a blanket to cover his feet with tabby socks, and he didn't wear shoes. Senior brother, Chu Shuang half-kneeled beside Huoju's wheelchair, stretched his hands along the blanket on Huoju's legs, and moved up along his ankles, gently kneading slowly. He raised his head and looked at Huoju. His eyes were as dark as a forest, glowing with faint green. He asked Huoju, "Is it true that you don't have any feeling in your legs?" Of course he still has consciousness, otherwise Huoju wouldn't be startled by his ankle being grabbed. It's just that even if he was conscious, Huoju couldn't stand up. His legs were as weak as his arms, which couldn't even hold the crossbow used by mortals. Huoju was startled by Chu Shuang's movements. He was at a loss for words for a moment. Chu Shuang had already moved up his calf under the blanket. Huoju quickly raised his hand across the blanket and pressed Chu Shuang's hand that was pressing on his knee. "Chu Shuang!" he called dryly. Huoju was about to ask "What are you doing?" when he felt the blanket on his lap being pulled off. Chu Shuang sat cross-legged on the ground, involuntarily hugged Huoju's feet and legs onto his lap, and said, "I'll help senior brother loosen his muscles and bones. Senior brother sits and doesn't move all day, so he must be numb." Huoju couldn't adapt to being so close to others, even if they were his juniors who grew up together. He wanted to retract his legs, but Chu Shuang, who had always been respectful and obedient to him, and even called him a junior master in private for many years, actually held him down a bit forcefully. "Senior brother," Chu Shuang looked up at Huoju with those dark eyes and said, "Let me help you." As he spoke, he massaged with moderate strength. Huoju froze, and his whole body fell into absurdity. But he did feel numb after sitting for a long time. After the 5 declines of heaven and man, he can only suffer this kind of discomfort that is not for outsiders. But Huoju would rather suffer than be used to Chu Shuang holding his leg. "Senior brother," Chu Shuang said coaxingly with a soft tone that he had never experienced before, "is this kind of strength okay? Senior brother, relax a little bit, I just want to make senior brother feel better. It doesn't need to be like this." Huoju's voice was a little heavy. He still tried to retract his feet, but his strength was negligible. Chu Shuang's tone was gentle, but his attitude was inexplicably tough. "Senior brother, every morning and evening from now on, I will help senior brother loosen his muscles and bones, so senior brother doesn't need to see me," Chu Shuang said in a low voice. "I know senior brother is suffering but I won't tell." Huoju didn't feel that his good junior was ironic, but instead he felt more and more strange as Chu Shuang said "senior brother." Chu Shuang is by no means a meticulous person. Why didn't he realize that he was uncomfortable? To say that it was the most uncomfortable, it was when the spiritual mansion was shattered at the beginning, and no spiritual power could be retained, and Huoju couldn't even stand up. At that time, Chu Shuang didn't considerately help him turn over, but just stood and guarded foolishly. Huoju frowned slightly, lowered his head and faced Chu Shuang's direction, but unfortunately he couldn't see Chu Shuang's expression at all, let alone see the hard-to-neglect layer of green covering Chu Shuang's eyes. Chu Shuang pressed and kneaded Huoju very carefully, making Huoju's calf and feet feel slightly hot, and he even used a little spiritual power to open up the stagnant meridians in Huoju's legs. Although these spiritual powers were destined to not last long in his meridians, such a long-lost smoothness still made Huoju's back slightly sweat. Sad to say, Huoju hadn't felt the feeling of sweating for many years, and he couldn't get used to it. Cultivators have always been able to regulate their body temperature without sweating, so Huoju's legs felt comfortable, but his body began to feel uncomfortable again. Since the beginning of the 5 declines, he has been taking a bath twice a day, and now he just finished washing in the morning, and he is sweating again because of the unobstructed meridians. Huojuejiao pursed her lips slightly, wondering which was more uncomfortable to let her legs go numb or sweat. Chu Shuang managed to let go of Huoju's feet, went to clean his hands and came back, then rubbed Huoju's shoulders and arms. "Huoju, Chu Shuang, please pay attention to the movements of the 2 elders in the door, you don't have to stay by my side all the time. Chu Shuang was by his side, so the voice came from Huoju's ear. Chu Shuang chuckled, stared at Huoju's reddish ear, and said, "Don't worry, senior brother, according to senior brother's instructions, the whole everything in the door is under control. Brother, your shoulders and neck are so stiff, relax a bit." The last word seemed a bit coquettish, which completely off Huoju. "Chu Shuang," Huoju said in a deep voice, "Go. Where are you going? Didn't I always follow the senior brother and obey the senior brother's orders?" When Chu Shuang said this, his hands were resting on Huoju's shoulders, and he tilted his head slightly from behind him to the side of his head to talk to him. This posture was like holding Huoju half in his arms. The pressure on his shoulders and the oppression brought by the weirdness of Chu Shuang made Huoju's hair stand on end. Although Huoju didn't have a delicate heart, he was once one of the best among the 4 sects in the cultivation world. He knew that it was impossible for a person to change his temperament so much overnight that he even changed his tone of voice. It is even more impossible for him to misunderstand that Chu Shuang has some ulterior motives for him. He has concluded that Chu Shuang is not right, maybe, was controlled by someone. In the blink of an eye, Huoju could only think that the other party was looking for an opportunity to steal the rebirth pool of the magic weapon on his neck. This is really tricky. Guan Zishi, the only elder under him who has cultivated to the escape realm, was ordered to go to the Hengzhi sect to find the whereabouts of the rebirth lotus. And even Chu Shuang, who is at the peak of the illusion-breaking realm, is controlled. The opponent must be a monk who has entered the cocoon soul realm above the mortal realm, in order to manipulate or even control the peak of the illusion-breaking realm. Cocoon Soul Cultivator. After the Pluto Sea is inverted, how many Cocoon Soul Realm cultivators are left in the war of gods and demons? If the opponent really came to the rebirth pool, Huoju would not have any ability to protect the magic weapon. Huoju felt desolate and flustered for a moment. As the saying goes, the tree fell and the monkeys scattered. Today's Tianyuan sword sect is no longer as prosperous and powerful as it used to be. Huoju's father, Huo Yuanfei, died at the hands of the demon god. Get lost. The Genpai's treasure, Rebirth Lotus, was also snatched by the demon god. Fearing the demon god's revenge, the elders of the sect and their disciples fled in all directions, and now the sect is falling apart. Apart from the third elder Guan Zishi and Chu Shuang, there are not many people around Huoju. If the rebirth pool falls into the hands of others, he will never have a chance to start again, and he will lose his only bargaining chip to deter the chaos in the door. At that time, other taboo elders in the sect will rush forward like wolves smelling meat. By then, his death will be minor, and the Tianyuan sword sect will be destroyed by him. In just a few breaths, Huoju's thoughts turned, and his mind was turned upside down. But when he spoke again, his flustered and sad emotions were firmly suppressed in his heart, and the discomfort and stiffness in his tone had disappeared, as if he had accepted the fact that his junior had suddenly changed his mind in a blink of an eye. Go to the canteen and bring me some food. My spiritual mansion is broken now, and I can't even use Bigu pill. Huoju withdrew Chu Shuang with reason. He had to quickly find a place to hide the regeneration pool. Hearing this, Chu Shuang stared at Huoju's side face for a while, then moved closer, almost touching Huoju's white and jade-like side face. Breathing so close that Huoju developed fine and dense pimples on the back of his neck, he even thought about how he would deal with this Chu Shuang if he broke his face. A life-saving talisman in the cuff is already under the palm. But the Chu Shuang who was half embracing Huoju didn't tear his face, but took away his hot breath with forbearance and regret. No, be patient. Chu Shuang warned himself not to be too casual. Huoju is a gentleman like a jade, and has always been cautious, so he can't act like a rascal. Chu Shuang even swallowed thirstily, before he could barely hold back the wanton desire not to kiss Huoju's side face. Chu Shuang licked his lips, and whispered into Huoju's ear, "Don't worry, senior brother, I went to prepare the meal early in the morning." The meal was being laid out on a table not far away, using extravagant techniques to keep it warm. Huoju was blind, and his 5 senses began to fade, and he didn't feel it at all. Chu Shuang said, "Brother, you're sweating, I'll help you with a cleansing technique first, and then I'll bring it to you, okay?" Yeah, with a coquettish nasal sound, right next to Huoju's ear. Huoju was used to Chu Shuang's carefree voice, but he really couldn't adapt to the tune of Chu Shuang's 18th bend of the mountain road. His expression almost cracked up. "It's so frustrating." However, Huoju couldn't hold back, tilting his head slightly to avoid the breath sprayed by Chu Shuang on his neck. He felt that the reason why the person who controlled or occupied the song double was so close to him and kept snorting at his neck was because he was looking for an opportunity to seize the treasure. Huoju's whole body was tense, and the talisman seals in his palms under the sleeves of his robe were all damp from his slightly wet palms. But Chu Shuang obviously didn't intend to tear his face apart, and soon the cleaning technique fell from the top of his head, and Huoju only felt that his body was sweating and sticky. And he keenly smelled the fragrance of grass and trees in this technique. Chu Shuang is the wood spirit mansion, and the cedar from Baisong Mountain grows on the Dao spiritual shield, so it shouldn't have the fragrance of summer flowers and weeds. It seems that it is a spiritual descending. If it is a puppet technique, it is impossible to have this residual fragrance of the original spiritual power. Huoju racked his brains to think back, but he couldn't think of any of the 4 sects who were monks from the Muling mansion in the Cocoon Soul realm. Only the Tianyuan sword sect in Baisong Mountain were all Muling mansion monks. Could it be one of the elders who led his disciples to escape when the Pluto Sea was upside down? But those elders, none of them are in the Cocoon Soul state, and the cultivation level of a cultivator who is only a small level away is a big difference. If you really reach the Cocoon Soul state, you can send spirits to others at will, and naturally you can come and go freely between heaven and earth. If you want to conceal your identity, you only need a blinding spell, which can't be detected if you are not of the same level of cultivation, so why is it so devious to descend on him? For a cultivator in the Cocoon Soul realm, it is easier to deal with him, with a broken spiritual mansion, than to crush an ant to death. Huoju really couldn't figure it out. But soon he didn't have time to think about the mess, because after he was cleaned up, Chu Shuang pushed it to the side of the table. Chu Shuang said in a tone like coaxing a child, "Brother, you can't see, your hands are weak, and it's not convenient for you to eat. I'll feed you." Not a negotiating tone. Soon the small array that kept the food warm was removed, and the aroma of the food permeated the air. Huoju was hungry all of a sudden. He was very restrained and only ate very little every day, but his 5 declines were irreversible. Now he was not even as strong as a mortal. If he didn't supplement food, how could he have strength? Huoju pursed his lips, instinctively resisting the temptation of the aroma of food. I began to ponder in my heart again, what exactly this Chu Shuang wanted to do. Pity him for being blind and unable to walk. It's too easy to kill him. Soon the aroma approached, and the spoonful of fragrant rice porridge approached Huoju's mouth. Chu Shuang said softly, "Brother, open your mouth." Huoju's thoughts were interrupted again. He opened his mouth to say, "I can eat it myself," and then was directly stuffed with a spoonful of rice porridge. The rice porridge had minced meat in it, and it was very fragrant, and Huoju's heart tightened again. The food of the Tianyuan sword sect was made by a mortal cook, and the cultivators paid attention to cultivating the mind, body to cut off emotions and desires, so the meals of the Tianyuan sword sect, the things that Tang makes, at most, can't kill people with medicine, and they will never taste good. Huoju ate porridge that was like washing pot water for several days, and he ate this fragrant porridge suddenly, and he didn't dare to swallow it immediately. Could it be that Chu Shuang wanted to poison him to death? But, why would a cultivator in the Cocoon Soul realm use such a trick? "Brother, is it delicious?" Chu Shuang said with a hint of showing off, "I cooked it last night. I cooked it for several hours. It's very nourishing. Eat more." Huoju heard the tone, and the hairs on his back stood up again, but what can he do now? I can only try my best to deal with it. So he swallowed the porridge slowly. Then Huoju heard the chuckle of Chu Shuang, and he was so nervous that he tightly clenched the talisman in his sleeve. But the pain of waiting for the poison to strike has not come, and the talisman he was about to kill was soaked in the hot sweat of his palm. What was waiting was another spoonful of rice porridge mixed with some refreshing side dishes. Huoju took another sip with a feeling that he couldn't explain it to outsiders. Because of not swallowing in time, some rice porridge landed on the corner of his lips. Huoju raised his hand to wipe it, when the other hand landed on the corner of his lips. Slowly wiped off the rice grains, brought them to his own lips and licked them off, but then rubbed Huoju's lips with his fingers, and said in his mouth, "Brother, you are so careless." Then fingers lingered on Huoju's lips, reluctant to leave. Huoju, whose lips were rubbed repeatedly. Huoju was born in the snow-capped cedar mountain that connects the sky and the earth, and his whole body is as clean as the thousands of miles of snowfield in Baisong Mountain. I have never experienced such a thing in my life, and I was a little dumbfounded for a while, and my whole body froze, and I didn't even know to hide for a while. Then Chu Shuang couldn't control himself for a while, and a phantom came out of the raised hand. Then when the phantom slowly condensed, it grew above Chu Shuang's hand, with 10 slender fingers reaching out to Huoju. This was like a haunted scene, but Fan Huoju was not blind, so he must have been shocked. It's a pity that Huoju couldn't see anything. The hand that condensed out of nowhere above Chu Shuang's arm, which replaced Chu Shuang, pressed against his lips again. The fragrance of plants and trees became stronger, and the fingertips, which were as white as jade, trembled after they were placed on Huoju's lips. But soon he made an inch, and pressed his fingers into Huoju's lips, was blocked by Huoju's teeth, and was scalded by the heat in his mouth, and then with a swish, he withdrew his hand. Chu Shuang put down the bowl, and the expression on the fingers holding him was also very blurred. The wetness and temperature of Huoju's mouth seemed to remain on the fingertips, and this temperature gradually turned into numbness, spreading from the fingertips all the way to the apex. As the saying goes, 10 fingers connect to the heart. Chu Shuang was very irritated, and the two of them were relatively speechless for a while. After a long while, Huoju frowned, sorted out his confused thoughts, and was about to open his mouth to leave Chu Shuang to hide in the rebirth pool. Chu Shuang got up and ran away by himself. Chu Shuang's ears were burning, his soul was burning, and his blood was rushing wildly in his body. After running outside the door, his knees suddenly softened, his eyes flashed, and he smashed towards the ground in an instant. At the same time, Mu Qinglan, who had been meditating by the window of Sushuan Pavilion, suddenly opened her eyes. She blushed, and directly raised her hand to bite her numb fingertips. In a few breaths, her face was like a peach blossom, beautiful and affectionate, her eyes were flowing, and she silently looked at the cedar courtyard where Huoju was. The Suizong courtyard was a bit chaotic at the moment. The 2 disciples guarding the gate hurriedly helped Chu Shuang, who fell to the ground inexplicably. Each of them was very frightened. Cultivators are different from mortals. At Chu Shuang's peak level of delusion-shattering realm, the only possibility of falling and dying is serious injury. But if he came out of the young master's room properly, how could he fall unconscious? Chu Shuang woke up quickly, feeling very confused. Huoju hurriedly called Chu Shuang to come in when he heard the voice. After asking, it turns out that Chu Shuang doesn't remember anything, and Chu Shuang's memory actually stays before falling asleep last night. I don't remember getting up this morning. Chu Shuang said in surprise. Sect Master, the juniors said that I was in your room before. What did I do and what did I say? Chu Shuang was a monk. Even if he wasn't particularly outstanding, he was at least a direct disciple of the dead headmaster Huo Yuanfei. He knew his situation, and he was afraid that he was controlled by others. Combined with the current situation in the door, the person who controlled him must want to seek the magic weapon rebirth pool that Huoju carried with him. You must know that even if there is no rebirth lotus, the rebirth pool cannot bring people back to life and reshape the muscles and bones, but it is a holy product for healing that is better than the best elixir. For monks, the rebirth pool is equivalent to a small spiritual vein. If Huoju's Lingfu had not been broken and irretrievable, the rebirth pool would have warmed him up long ago. Chu Shuang asked frightenedly, "Sect leader, when I lost control, did you have any idea to use the rebirth pool?" "The rebirth pool is now. It's still on me." Before Huoju had time to hide the rebirth pool, he heard that Chu Shuang had passed out. Huoju didn't know why the person who occupied Chu Shuang left suddenly, but he knew that the Chu Shuang in front of him was normal. Chu Shuang also breathed a sigh of relief when he heard that the respawn pool was still there. But at the same time, Chu Shuang poured spiritual power into the meridians to check his physical condition, but quickly said to Huoju with a strange expression, "My body's meridians are smooth, and there is no abnormality in the Lingfu." Huoju frowned slightly when he heard about it. He couldn't figure it out again. If it was the cocoon soul cultivator who had conspired to seize the magic weapon, it would be impossible for Chu Shuang's body to be safe and sound. There is a huge gap between cocoon soul and the peak of shattering delusion realm. This is like a tank that can hold water, but cannot withstand the sudden arrival of a boulder. The monks who have been descended by the spirit will have their meridians torn apart, and their spiritual palace will be shattered in severe cases. But Chu Shuang's body was safe and sound. This is wrong. Chu Shuang obviously also knew that his state didn't look like being descended by spirits. The two senior brothers racked their brains, but couldn't figure out what was going on. "Young master, what should we do?" Chu Shuang had no idea, and asked Huoju instinctively. Huoju's eyes were covered with white gauze, and he was sitting in a wheelchair like Yushan. His heart was anxious and confused, but his face was still calm. He raised his hand and said to Chu Shuang, "Come here." Chu Shuang hurriedly approached, standing in front of Huoju like a silly pillar, not understanding what Huoju meant. Huoju moved his outstretched hand, pressed down his slender and fair palm, and said, "Squat down." Only then did Chu Shuang squat down and let Huoju put his hands on top of his head. "Grab my other hand and send me spiritual power," Huoju ordered. Chu Shuang complied. Huoju couldn't use his spiritual power by himself, but the spiritual power that Chu Shuang sent into his meridians was still useful. It's like a bamboo basket leaking water, but as long as the speed is fast and the volume is large, there will always be some left when the water comes out, and these are enough. A bright light flashed in the room, and Huoju hovered above Chu Shuang's head with his palm, and quickly drew a well-known magic circle on top of Chu Shuang's head. Because of Huoju's forcible use of spiritual power, the blood on his face was instantly wiped clean. With a pale face, he gritted his teeth and pressed the formation into Chu Shuang Lingtai. It's the solid soul array. Chu Shuang only felt that his soul was turned into a spiritual flow array, like a needle thread, tightly sewn into his body. After Huoju withdrew his hand, his breathing was scattered, and his trembling palms were powerless to hang down. "Young master!" Chu Shuang hurriedly supported Huoju's uncontrollable body, which fell forward, and poured spiritual power into his meridians. But it's useless. People with broken spirit mansions use their spiritual power, which will only speed up the speed of spiritual power collapse. The spiritual power submerging into Huoju's body was like a mud cow entering the sea. Chu Shuang could only hold back his hands, supporting Huoju, and shouted anxiously, "Less master, less master. I'm fine." Huoju's voice was weak, his lips turned blue. Supporting Chu Shuang's hands, he propped up his body, leaned against the back of the chair and said, "After you have fixed your soul, don't go to sleep these days, and remember to add another restriction when you enter meditation at night to prevent being controlled again." Chu Shuang nodded. It should be that he was too tired from running around these days and couldn't hold on to sleep last night, otherwise he wouldn't have been taken advantage of by others. "Young master, you should enter the rebirth pool to recuperate," Chu Shuang suggested. Huoju shook his head. It's useless, his spiritual palace is broken, it's all futile. Besides, opening the rebirth pool in Cedar Court now, isn't it attracting people to it? Although the sect never took the disciples to escape, the fourth elder and the seventh elder who had been eyeing the rebirth pond all the time, couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't take the opportunity to make trouble. It is impossible for Huoju to take such a risk in order to nourish his body. Huoju leaned on the chair with his elbows, braced himself and said, "It's all right, is there any news about Elder Yushin?" Elder Yushin is the elder Guanzishi sent by Huoju. He is the third elder in the sect. Elder Yushin did not send a letter back, and now the head of the Hengzhu sect has become the immortal Master Yanling. Chu Shuang said, "Immortal Master Yanling appears and disappears, and it is said that he will go to Tianweishan with that demon cultivator, but there is no trace of him." Huoju nodded slowly, unable to hold on any more. But he refused to show it in front of Chu Shuang. Chu Shuang didn't have a mind, he only knew how to follow orders, and it was extremely easy to get distracted and be seen by others. Nowadays, even the guards stationed by the royal family in the sect have impure purposes. Huoju, as a useless person in the sect, relies on his previous power to deter everyone. He is like being in a pack of wolves. Once he shows weakness, the pack of wolves will inevitably attack him. Therefore, Huoju gritted his teeth, the thin veins on his forehead were raised, he raised his hand to cover his head, and said to Chu Shuang, "Go, pay close attention to the two elders in the door, and you can relax a little when the senior sister comes back. These days, thank you for your hard work." What did the senior brother say? But the senior sister sent a letter, and she will be back soon. Huoju suppressed his trembling. Chu Shuang, a heartless person, thought that Huoju was fine if he showed that he was fine, and he didn't know how to investigate his landslide spiritual mansion, which was silently tormenting him because of the use of spiritual energy just now. Chu Shuang was used to obeying and relying on Huoju and his senior sisters and brothers since he was a child, so he didn't have that string in his mind. So Chu Shuang went out to meditate. When Chu Shuang went out, Huoju's arms flickered, he couldn't hold on any more, and collapsed on the chair in a state of embarrassment. Cold sweat was about to soak his back. With trembling hands, he held down the knife-like lingfu, panting carefully, not daring to take a large breath. After a long time, he let out a miserable laugh dripping with sweat, moved the wheelchair with difficulty, and returned to the side of the bed. Huoju almost crawled back onto the bed, covered in sweat. He didn't have the strength to change clothes, wash up, let alone apply cleaning techniques to himself. He didn't even have the strength to pull the quilt, so he could only hunched over, reluctantly shrunk himself on the bed, and lay on his side to endure this wave of turmoil in the lingfu, the pain like being stabbed by a knife. Before he passed out, he managed to gather some strength, and put the rebirth pool, the magic weapon that he had been wearing close to his body, in the hidden cabinet next to the bed. There is a miniature ring space inside, except for the rune code, it is difficult to find, and it is even more difficult to break. After hiding the respawn pool, Huoju finally couldn't hold on anymore and passed out. He had a very chaotic dream. In the dream, he was only a teenager, and he went down the mountain with his senior sister and juniors to practice. What they were dealing with was a nightmare beast, not fierce enough, but hard to catch. And it must enter a person's dream, and only when it is eating the dream can it be caught. Since ancient times, the dirtiest thing is the human heart. Especially for those who have never practiced, the thoughts and desires in their minds can turn into raging waves, devouring and smashing the dreamer. They were injured in the dreams of several people. One night, they entered a dream, but it was peaceful and warm. In the dream, there was only a young girl, holding the injured little beast in her hand and feeding it. The little beast was the nightmare beast that incarnated in the girl's dream. It was hunted down by them for a long time, and all four legs were injured. In this dream, it doesn't need to weave ridiculous dreams of wealth, and can heal its wounds in the soft palm of the girl. It doesn't even eat the dream of the girl, and the monks are all stunned for a while. How can a mortal have such a pure heart, which even many monks who have attained the Tao cannot do? Huoju walked over and asked the girl for the nightmare beast. The girl's long black hair hung down beside her, and she slowly turned her head when she heard this. Brother, drink it, drink the medicine, and you will feel better. Huoju seemed to be pulled from a ridiculous dream and fell into another dream, becoming a nightmare beast lying in the girl's palm. His limp limbs were dragged gracefully, and those hands avoided all his inhuman pain. He was in a daze, and he hadn't fully woken up yet, only hearing a gentle voice coaxing in his ear. Brother, be obedient and open your mouth. Huoju was so thirsty that his throat was on fire. He opened his mouth instinctively, pouring the slightly bitter soup into his mouth. This soup is not like medicine at all, it has a fragrance like grass, trees, and flowers. As soon as you drink it, the soft spiritual power instantly calms the restless and torn meridians, and the turbulence in the spiritual mansion is also smoothed out by the gentle warmth. Huoju suddenly woke up. He opened his eyes, but couldn't see anything. I was leaning tightly in another person's arms. A familiar voice called his senior brother. The solid soul seal is useless. Chu Shuang is under control again. Huoju realized that Chu Shuang was being controlled again, and there seemed to be a fresh scent of grass and trees that belonged to the other party in his words, and he felt that he had already been tricked. The lower jaw of Chu Shuang rested on the top of Huoju's head, and lightly pressed on the top of his head. Wen Sheng said, Brother, the inner palace is broken, so don't use your spiritual power rashly in the future. Brother, did it hurt just now? A gentle voice rang above Huoju's head, and Huoju's hair stood on end. Chu Shuang touched Huoju's abdomen with his hand, and there was a soft, bluish aura, just like spring rain moistening the earth, and scattered into Huoju's broken lingfu. Huoju was so comfortable that he almost wanted to sigh. This kind of pure spiritual power is definitely beyond the reach of ordinary monks. The opponent's cultivation base is unfathomable, and the purpose is even more unclear. Huoju clenched his robe sleeves tightly and sat up straight in fear. Although he couldn't see, he tried his best to turn his head in the direction of Chu Shuang. Chu Shuang circled him Sugzu, supported him, and let him turn his face away. The two looked at each other. Chu Shuang slowly stretched out his hand, and his fingertips hooked the white gauze over Huoju's eyes. Huoju met Huoju, although his shape was very beautiful, but his eyes were grey and unfocused. Chu Shuang couldn't hold back, and once again his fingers separated from his body to condense a phantom, and then solidified the phantom, pressing on Huoju's eyebrows. The light white fingertips slowly traced Huoju's eyebrows like the mountains in the painting. Brother, your eyes are so beautiful. Even if it lost the clean and snow-like clarity at the Mu family's banquet, it was still as hazy and charming as the misty June. Huoju's lips moved, and the phrase "Which senior are you, what exactly do you want?" reached his throat, but he still swallowed it. He has no ability to fight back now. If the opponent appears in such a sneaky way, if he takes the initiative to expose it at this time, it will only make the opponent act faster. So Huoju pursed his lips again, without moving or speaking. He quickly thought about how to counterattack. Probably because Huoju didn't even dodge for a moment, Chu Shuang was stimulated by the appearance of allowing others to do things. After carefully describing Huoju's eyebrows, Chu Shuang raised his hand, hooked Huoju's shoulder tentatively, and Huoju hugged. Huoju has never hugged anyone in his life, so he won't move. His mother died young, and his seniors were always in awe of him because he was the son of the head of the sect. Even his father Huo Yuanfei never hugged him so intimately in Huoju's memory. Huoju couldn't see with his eyes, and his five senses became sharper than he hadn't seen in a long time because of the pure spiritual power entrenched in the inner palace. When he heard the sigh beside his ear, he felt as if he had lost his mind. In this hug, he felt the feeling of being cherished that he had never experienced before. Huoju was as stiff as a long-rotted log, and the increasing force on his shoulders was so strong that it was about to bind his rotten log into pieces. Huoju couldn't hold back a painful snort. The Chu Shuang who was holding him immediately relaxed, and turned his head, probably wanting to talk, but the two of them were hugging too close. Chu Shuang turned his head, just as if Ruawa was swept by Huoju's warm breath. Huoju didn't notice at all, he was very confused, he was thinking about how to save Chu Shuang if the soul imprint didn't work. As a result, Chu Shuang froze, and stretched out his hand to touch his face in a daze, thinking that the warm breath was Huoju's lips. Chu Shuang let go of Huoju and ran off the ground. After running 2 steps, Chu Shuang slapped straight to the ground and passed out again. Huoju suddenly lost his support, and fell back on the bed limply all over. His head couldn't rest on the pillow accurately, and fell on the somewhat hard bed board, with a clang. Huoju's head was shaken, but his thoughts cleared up. He thought of a desperate solution. He heard the sound of Chu Shuang falling to the ground, presumably the other party left again. Huoju was about to ask someone to come in, but Chu Shuang stood up from the ground again. "Brother, did you hurt from the fall?" Chu Shuang quickly helped Huoju up, rubbed his palms on the back of Huoju's head, and said with a creepy and coquettish tone, "You scared me, why did you kiss me all of a sudden?" Huoju. "What? Stop kissing! This is not my body!" Panic. Huoju. "What thing? What exactly is occupying Chu Shuang's body?" Fortunately, Chu Shuang didn't continue talking, and slowly put Huoju down, and when Huoju was blocked by chaotic thoughts and was about to explode, he began to rub Huoju's whole body. "Start with the shoulders and arms and work your way down." Huoju was tense like a piece of wood, but the palm of Chu Shuang carried an undeniable pure spiritual power, which could be said to be crazily poured into Huoju's meridians. It made Huoju instinctively weak all over, and he couldn't tense up at all. After a while, Huoju was sweating profusely, and his whole body was submerged in the fragrance of plants and trees, as if he had fallen into a dense forest and was lying on the soft and fluffy grass. Huoju didn't know what this man was going to do, he even thought that this man came here to humiliate him. But he didn't have the ability to resist directly, so he could only bear it passively. He was amazed that the opponent's spiritual power was so deep that it was almost endless, and saddened that his body was like a bamboo basket with leaks on all sides. After half an hour of massaging and infusion of spiritual power, if a normal low-level monk is lying here, he can be injected into the realm. But these spiritual powers are like river water in a broken jar, it will never be full in his meridians, and it is wasted in vain. This kind of extravagant waste made Huoju couldn't help but said, "That's it." Huoju raised his hand to hold Chu Shuang and the hand on his shoulder, and used a pun to prevent Chu Shuang from continuing. Chu Shuang stopped and asked Huoju, "Is senior brother feeling better?" Huoju hasn't been this comfortable for a long time. But he didn't even know who or what it was that made him so comfortable. Huoju didn't say anything. He thought of the decapitated meal in the mortal world. It is said that the last meal of the condemned prisoner is always very good. He expected that no matter what the person occupying Chu Shuang's body wanted to do, he should do it. But Huoju lay there and waited for a while, until he got a cleansing spell that made him more comfortable. Then I waited until a glass of water with a suitable temperature was delivered to my mouth. Huoju drank it obediently, thinking of ways to fight back and save Chu Shuang. He stood still, anyway, he had already hidden in the rebirth pool. "Brother, are you hungry? Shall I go and make you some pancakes?" Huoju Lingfu was entangled and comforted by the remaining pure spiritual power, and the previous feeling of being stabbed by a knife was completely gone. He sat up with his arms propped up, turned his head to the direction of Chu Shuang, paused, and said, "I'm a little hungry." Huoju's heart beat a little faster. He said, "I want to eat some cakes and some porridge. And yesterday's refreshing side dishes. Pancakes are easy to make, but porridge needs to be boiled." He wanted to send Chu Shuang away as soon as possible, and then try to get the storage bag on the desk. Huoju now only regrets that he didn't wear the storage bag close to his body because it was too cumbersome to take a shower twice a day. There are spirit stones of various grades, a large number of thick talisman seals, and some small magic tools, which are all of Huoju's net worth. Now the monk elder Yushin who can be used by him is not there, and the senior sister also took her disciples down the mountain to catch the monster that fled to Baisong country when the underworld star sea was upside down. He must use the shortest time to find and drive away the person who is occupying and controlling Chu Shuang's body. Otherwise, after a long time, Chu Shuang's meridians will be torn apart, and his cultivation will not improve, and at worst, he will become a useless person with a broken spiritual palace just like him. Huoju wants to eat this and that, because he wants to take Chu Shuang away for a longer time, so he can arrange it. This strategy is really not clever, but Chu Shuang seems to have not noticed it. He was quite happy to hear that Huoju asked for a lot of things. Full of promise, "Okay brother." Chu Shuang asked, "What kind of cake do you like, brother? Salty or sweet?" Huoju's mind turned into a pot of porridge, and he instinctively replied, "Salty and sweet." Chu Shuang patted his chest even more when he heard the words, and assured him, "Don't worry, brother, I am best at salty and sweet, brother wait for me." After Chu Shuang finished speaking, he was very unsteady, and ran away in a flash. Huoju followed the voice and turned to look at the door, confirming that Chu Shuang had really left. Only then did he get off the ground, fumbled for the wheelchair, moved himself up, and went to get the storage bag. After that, Huoju called the disciples outside the door to come in. "Take your disciples out of the cedar courtyard, and don't come in if you hear strange noises later." Huoju handed the jade token he took out from the storage bag to his disciple, and said, "Unless I call you on the jade token." "Sect leader, what happened?" "Brother Chu Shuang, he go." Huoju said, "Your brother Chu Shuang will be back in a while." Huoju didn't know what the result would be when he met Chu Shuang. The opponent's cultivation was unfathomable. These juniors are not good at cultivation. If they were there, they might hurt their lives. Even if Huoju has become a now, he still takes it as his duty to protect his disciples habitually. It is impossible for him to tell his disciples and let them take risks with him. After all the disciples left the cedar courtyard, Huoju began to push the wheelchair, took out the high-grade spirit stones in the storage bag, and set up formations in the room. If he wants to fight Hedon, it is tantamount to hitting a stone with an egg, but if he deploys a formation, there is still a way to lightly injure the opponent's soul. As long as the soul of the monk in the cocoon state is damaged, it is difficult to descend to others in a short period of time. Huoju turned the wheelchair to arrange the spirit stones and talismans, and then took out the soul thread that he hadn't used for so many years. This thing has always been in Huoju's storage bag. He actually doesn't need it at all, but he doesn't know why, so he never throws it away. This kind of soul silk is made from shark tendons, and as long as the cultivation level is strong enough, it can trap all living creatures with souls. But this kind of thing has great limitations. For example, in order for the silk to bind the soul to work, it must have the breath of the soul that it wants to bind. But all intelligent creatures know that they should not leave their soul aura easily, so as not to be used by others. Some evil cultivators can even use the soul aura to pretend to be the master's magic weapon and manipulate the magic weapon to devour the master. Therefore, this bundle of soul silk is basically useless, and Huoju has completely forgotten where he got it from. Not only that, but at the bottom of his storage bag, there is also a soul restraining cauldron. This kind of thing can only be used to restrain the soul, but for all the disciples who have a mountain gate, there is a life token in the mountain. If they accidentally die, the life token will extradite the soul to the sect for convergence. Therefore, this soul-suppressing cauldron is something that monks can't use at all, and even something that only evil cultivators can use. Huoju touched the soul-detaining cauldron in his hand, but he didn't remember when and where he got it. It comes in a storage bag, and what is it for? But today, these two useless instruments came in handy. Naturally, he was no match for a cocoon soul cultivator who could descend on others, but the soul-binding silk could restrain the opponent for a short period of time, and with the help of talisman seals, he tried to injure his soul, so he didn't have to worry about Chu Shuang being descended again. This is very risky. In his heyday, Huoju might be able to save his life under Cocoon Soul's master, but now he is a useless person. His time must be a disaster. But he had to save Chu Shuang. The senior sister is coming back soon, and Huoju also left a way out for himself. If his body is destroyed, as long as he gets into the soul-detaining cauldron in time, he can save his soul. At that time, he can continue to wait for the whereabouts of the rebirth lotus in the state of a soul. Huoju was planning while setting up his formation. His eyes were not covered with white sand at the moment, and his misty light grey eyes made him look bleak and sad. He used to be the leader of the young generation of sword repairers in Baisongshan, and he was full of vigor and hatred. Now this body. Huoju began to hate himself while he was dying. He always had the urge to self-destruct. If it wasn't for the heavy burden of the Tianyuan sword sect, he would have lost his spirit and entered the snow-capped mountains long ago. At this moment, Huoju felt an unspeakable joy in his heart as he planned to die with the cocoon soul monk who occupied Chu Shuang's body. It is better to let go of his dilapidated spiritual palace and weak body. He arranged the formation, used almost all the talismans, sat on the chair, turned his head towards the window, and waited quietly. The afternoon sun shone through the window. Huoju could feel the light, but he couldn't see a trace of warm yellow at all. His face was bathed in the sun, shining like a jade statue. His straight back was the backbone that he would not bend when he died as the young master of Tianyuan sword sect. Different from his tragic and majestic situation, he managed to become a Chu Shuang who walked back after eating and eating. He never expected that what was waiting for him was not a good senior, but a trap carefully arranged by a good senior. When Chu Shuang walked quickly into the room with the food box in hand, he keenly noticed that the disciples guarding the gate were gone. Huoju's arrangement was really not very detailed. He was blind after all. This trap was almost a few feet away, and he was beating drums and drums to tell others that it was a trap. Chu Shuang stood still at the door, clutching the food box tightly in his hand. Huoju was sitting in the room, facing the door, and when he heard the footsteps of Chu Shuang, he turned his head from the window and looked at Chu Shuang calmly and as if death was at home with those foggy eyes. He felt what Chu Shuang had discovered, and sighed in his heart. It didn't work out. Even if Huoju didn't know what he drank before, he was able to set up this formation because he got the soul breath of the person occupying Chu Shuang's body. But it was still too crude to be discovered. It seemed that today could not end well. Huoju clenched the soul-detaining cauldron in his robe sleeve tightly. But he still opened his mouth, and his tone could be said to be gentle, asking you to enter the urn, saying, "You are back? Come in." Chu Shuang stood at the door, knowing that she was exposed. She didn't intend to hide the fact that she was not Chu Shuang. She could have easily destroyed the rough formation set up by the blind man, but when she heard Huoju gently calling her in, how could she not go in? Huoju probably never imagined that he had set up this rough formation, but he himself became the most irresistible bait in the formation. As long as he sits there, it's like a bunch of fire burning in the dark night, which can attract moths to jump on it at any time. It is good. Holding the food box, she stared straight at Huoju, slightly curled her lower lip, and walked steadily into the formation carefully arranged for her. The moment Chu Shuang stepped into the formation, soul strands visible to the naked eye surged from all directions of the formation, frantically penetrating into Chu Shuang's body. Although Huoju couldn't see it, he kept staring in the direction of Chu Shuang and tightened his grip on the soul-holding cauldron nervously, his heart full of death. The monks in the cocoon soul realm are not that easy to deal with, and Huoju has never really fought against the Cocoon Soul Realm monks in his life. If the opponent attacks him, Huoju thinks he has no power to fight back. However, the formation has already been activated, and the soul strands refined from the mermaid tendons are definitely not something that can be cut by ordinary swords. Even if they can't restrain the person occupying Chu Shuang's body, they will definitely be able to lightly injure them. In the formation, the soul strings penetrated into the body of Chu Shuang, and did not hurt Chu Shuang at all, because these soul strings were like dogs smelling. With the same breath, they directly pierced the body of Chu Shuang. Entered the soul occupying Chu Shuang's body. Soon, the talismans in each position of the formation spontaneously ignited, and the fierce sword energy, as strong as a sword, walked along the soul thread, and quickly penetrated into the person who was bound by the soul thread and pulled out of Chu Shuang's body. Chu Shuang limply fell to the ground, and the soul-binding silk tied the pulled-out soul to the center of the formation like iron ropes binding a monster. A gust of wind blew up in the room, moving Huoju's long hair and robes, and he sat there with cold eyes, as awe-inspiring and inviolable as before. The person who was pulled out of Chu Shuang's body looked straight at Huoju's state, being tormented by the wind and sword energy, but she kept smiling. If any of the disciples guarding the cedar courtyard appeared, they would find that the person who had been making trouble for several days, occupying Chu Shuang's body and walking, and forced Huoju to death was none other than someone else, and it was at this very moment that he was still silent. Meditating in Sushuan Pavilion, Mu Qinglan was the newlywed who was ignored by Huoju. It's a pity that because of Huoju's order, the Cedar Academy doesn't have a single disciple. Huoju's eyes were clouded by rain and mist, and he couldn't see Mu Qinglan's appearance at the moment, let alone Mu Qinglan smiling at him. Huoju heard Chu Shuang's limp voice, and knew that the formation was completed and Chu Shuang was saved, but he also knew that if the other party became angry, they might kill him and Chu Shuang together. So Huoju opened his mouth to attract the attention of the people in the formation. Said, "Your Excellency, I don't know what sect I studied under, but I don't know that in today's world, there is such a style of hiding in other people's bodies. What is the ulterior purpose of using such sneaky moves to come to my Baisong Mountain Tianyuan sword sect?" Huoju deliberately made his words ugly, just to annoy the people in the formation who were targeting him alone. However, those who have a higher level of cultivation are either extremely conceited, or they are self-centered, or they are supercilious, and they are rarely soft-tempered. Huoju's age is relatively young in the realm of comprehension. These words are tricky and attack from the perspective of teacher, conduct, etc., and he uses animal metaphors. He is expected to arouse the other party's senses. But after Huoju finished speaking, he waited for a while, but nothing happened. The opponent did not growl and scold in anger, nor did he make a fatal attack. Huoju tilted his ears slightly, and could hear that the formation was still going on. Those talismans were almost used up, and the sword chi had scratched deep holes on Mu Qinglan's body, and under the influence of the pure spiritual power surrounding her, heals fast. When she was pulled out of Chu Shuang's body, it wasn't that Huoju was thinking about the soul, but that she had condensed into a solid body. Her body was covered with bloodstains left by the rapid healing of the skin and flesh, one after another, as if she had suffered Ling Qi. But she knelt down and stared at Huoju, listening to what he said. She immediately understood his purpose. Looking back at Chu Shuang, he wondered why such a fool as Chu Shuang could be protected by Huoju with death. Mu Qinglan admitted that she was jealous of this idiot. She stood up from the ground with her hands on her hands, and pulled the soul bundle. The soul bundle on her chest immediately turned a blood-stained bright red. Mu Qinglan stepped on Chu Shuang's fingers and rolled her hard. Jealousy made her eyes turn green. Seeing Huoju's tense look, Mu Qinglan couldn't help but think, if the sky hadn't collapsed and the sea of stars had not been turned upside down, and Huoju hadn't had his spiritual mansion broken, how good it would be for her to worship Baisong Mountain and be a junior sister, then Huoju would definitely do the same. Protect her like this. Huoju keenly heard that the formation was being pulled, thinking that the other party was about to make a move, took a deep breath, and smelled the smell of blood. Huoju's face turned pale in an instant. His spirit would not bleed, it could only be Chu Shuang's. Huoju was anxious, and immediately said, "Your Excellency, is it possible that you are even afraid of a useless person like me? Dare to ask who you are, and what is the purpose of coming to my Tianyuan sword sect?" Huoju became anxious when he heard that. Mu Qinglan moved her foot away from Chu's fingers without breaking it. She knew how nervous Huoju was about his junior. How could he hurt him, and he hadn't hurt him these days, but when he occupied his body, he trapped his soul in a corner of his body. Now that Mu Qinglan has been pulled out of Chu Shuang's body, she naturally dare not speak. The reason why she used Chu Shuang's body to get close to Huoju was partly because Huoju couldn't see her, and she was anxious. The other part is because the Mu Qinglan whom the Mu family sent to marry as a substitute is a cultivator at the early stage of breaking the delusion, and it is absolutely impossible for her to possess the ability to occupy other people's bodies. But Mu Qinglan saw that Huoju was too anxious, and her heart ached too much. She didn't care about the constraints of her soul. She got up and walked towards Huoju step by step. The flesh and blood were strangled by the soul-binding silk, and then grew back again. The blood flowed to the surrounding ground along the soul-binding silk, but Mu Qinglan seemed to be unconscious. This injury was nothing to her. The corner of her mouth overflowed with blood, and the formation in the room felt the resistance, and they fought back crazily. The talismans burned one after another, turned into sharp knives, and pierced Mu Qinglan's body. Mu Qinglan only shook it a few times, and even lifted the food box firmly. The cakes she made inside were still hot. Step by step, she walked up to Huoju and bloody, half kneeling in front of Huoju with a strong smell of blood and choking vegetation. Huoju was clasping the soul-detaining cauldron in one hand, and the jade token in the other. As long as he poured a little spiritual energy into it, the disciples waiting outside the cedar courtyard would rush over. But Huoju never moved. He had no intention of letting his disciples lose their lives. The other party was able to move around at will under the restraint of Shihunsi. Huoju didn't show it on the face, his heart was already cold, he was really impulsive. If the opponent doesn't leave after being lightly injured, and slaughters the mountain madly, they are like a group of sheep waiting to be slaughtered. How can they resist? Huoju's breathing was a little flustered, his thoughts turned, and he gathered all the ugly words he had ever heard in his life, preparing to provoke the other party to kill him to vent his anger, just begging not to implicate his fellow disciples. But Huoju's heart is cleaner than Wan Li Suiwen, so how can he say any bad words? He groaned and groaned for a long time, and thought of an exaggerated sentence that could irritate the other party. Could it be that Your Excellency is a member of the devil? It was too much for Huoju to ask himself, because it is impossible for a person in the demonic way to descend into a monk's body without harming it, let alone possess pure spiritual power, and all righteous monks are ashamed to fall into the demonic way. In Huoju's mind, this was a curse word. But he still couldn't wait for a response, he was so anxious that he was sweating, his back was sticky and uncomfortable. Then he waited for a while, but before he could get any angry attacks and scolding, he waited for a cleansing technique. The spiritual power spell wrapped in the fragrance of grass and trees covered Huoju's head, removing the stickiness and sweat on his body. Huoju was stunned. Mu Qinglan raised her hand to perform the spell, and the soul-binding silk was strangled into her arm. She ignored it at all, just looked at Huoju for a moment, and almost laughed out loud. But she held back her lips. Not daring to reveal her voice, Mu Qinglan was dragged by the soul string, and half knelt down beside Huoju. Then dragged the food box on the ground, opened the food box, and the aroma inside was filled with blood and grassy fragrance. If Huoju could see it, he would be speechless in shock. Mu Qinglan was bound like a marionette by the soul-binding silk, and was cut into pieces by Huoju's talisman at the bottom of the box, but the food box she was carrying didn't even sprinkle the rice porridge inside. Huoju pursed his lips and frowned, he hated himself for being blind and unable to see anything. I don't know how Chu Shuang is, and I can't judge what the situation is now. He didn't say anything more, mainly because he really couldn't think of anything else to say that was irritating and ugly. Mu Qinglan put the lid of the food box on the ground, and didn't rush to get the food, but looked at Huoju's furrowed eyebrows and panic in his eyes from bottom to top. She stretched out her hand and lightly touched Huoju's fingertips. Huoju shrank his hand suddenly, and the jade tablet in his palm fell to the ground. Huoju subconsciously reached out to fish for it, and Mu Qinglan grabbed his wrist and put it on her shoulder. Huoju touched the stickiness with his hands, and soon realized that it was all blood. Huoju's eyelashes trembled rapidly, and he retracted his hands and sat up straighter than the coffin boards. He thought frightenedly, what's going on? The other party has a body and is bleeding. Did he hurt the wrong person? Chu Shuang! Huoju called out anxiously. Mu Qinglan pursed her lips, took Huoju's hand, opened his palm, and wrote stroke by stroke, he's fine. Huoju shrank his fingers and held the 3 words in his palm, his whole body tensed. Mu Qinglan opened his hands one by one, and wrote, are you satisfied? Huoju tilted his head slightly, his face full of confusion. He didn't know what was going on, why the other party fell into a trap and was restrained by the soul silk, but was able to condense the entity, why he was repeatedly stimulated, and did not go crazy, but... Mu Qinglan grabbed his wrist again and let him touch the blood on her body. I wrote it again stroke by stroke in his palm, I'm hurt, are you satisfied? You want me to hurt, how can I not hurt? Mu Qinglan looked at him and smiled. Huoju withdrew his hand, swallowed, and called out, Your Excellency. Who is it? Huoju asked. Mu Qinglan didn't answer, but cleaned up the blood on his hands and cleaned herself up, and then took out the cakes at a suitable temperature from the food box. Mu Qinglan took out the soul-detaining cauldron held in Huoju's other hand and threw it on the ground, then put a plate on his lap, asked him to hold it with his hands, and took him to touch it. It's cake. Huoju simply didn't know how to face this situation. Mu Qinglan took his hand and described it in detail, salty and sweet, you eat. Then he picked up one and stuffed it in his palm. Huoju swallowed, and looked down at Mu Qinglan in front of him. His eyes were grey under the setting sun, but Mu Qinglan had the illusion that he could see it, because Huoju's eyes were full of puzzlement. Mu Qinglan supported his hand, took Huoju's hand holding the pancake, and brought it to his lips. Huoju took a bite as if bewitched. Mu Qinglan laughed, she actually wanted to hug Huoju, kiss him, talk to him, be with him, but definitely not in this situation. Seeing that he had eaten, Mu Qinglan was satisfied, stood up, and threw herself towards Huoju, but in the blink of an eye, her body turned into a spirit mist, which disappeared in front of Huoju loudly and soundlessly. Huoju swallowed a mouthful of food, and smelled a refreshing fragrance of grass and trees, and the spiritual power that rushed to his face enveloped him, and his long hair moved automatically without wind. The painful Lingfu was comforted again. The bundled soul silk lost its bound object, changed into the shape of a magic weapon, circled around, and landed on the ground. Huoju put down the cake, reached out to touch it, and found the jade tablet that was picked up and put on his lap at some point. That person picked it up for him, so that he could call his disciples in to clean up the mess. Huoju pursed his lips and turned his head towards the door. For some reason, his heart was beating fast. The pure spiritual mist still surrounds him for a long time like a tight hug. Mu Qinglan returned to her Sushuan pavilion, and returned to the body she was meditating on as a cover-up. I sigh in my heart that Huoju is the young head of the Tianyuan sword sect. Even if the Lingfu is broken and blind, he still has the ability to be unstoppable. Mu Qinglan pressed the place on her heart where the soul string had passed through, and smiled as she wished. He ate the pie he made. Mu Qinglan was sitting on the chair, her face was pink and her eyes were shy. That kind of cake was called mother-in-law cake. It was the dry food that married women made for their husbands who went to work in the fields. Although Mu Qinglan and Huoju haven't visited yet, in Mu Qinglan's view, they are already a real couple. Huoju kissed her even though he knew she was not Chu Shuang. Mu Qinglan smiled, and accidentally vomited some blood. The soul-beaming silk and those talisman blades had directly injured her soul, and she was indeed not seriously injured. But thinking that this injury was caused by the formation that Huoju personally arranged for her, Mu Qinglan wished that she would recover slowly, so she didn't even try to make herself recover quickly. Seeing her vomiting blood and smiling strangely, the people serving her surrounded her in shock, but there was no worry in their eyes. These people were sent by the Mu family to monitor her. "Miss, pay attention to your body, and don't rush to practice for a while." The leader was an older woman, with bland eyes, blue lips and a face that had been poisoned for a long time. Her name was Yeluo. She is the nanny next to Mu Wanran, the eldest daughter of the Mu family. She has cultivated to the middle stage of Shattering Delusion realm in her middle age, and she has eaten Zuyin pill, but her cultivation base is stuck at the peak of Shattering Delusion realm. It's still young, but inside it's a rotten old thing that's near the end of its lifespan. Yeluo winked at the other two maids, and the two little maids left quickly. Yeluo helped Mu Qinglan up, and took out the puppet guru relieving bottle from his arms, poured out a pill, and gave it to Mu Qinglan. She said like giving alms, "Eat, Miss Mu, forgive me for speaking harshly, after eating, stop doing useless exercises." She thought that Mu Qinglan vomited blood because of her rash practice. Persuading him with malicious intentions, "Missy told you to complete the task early, there are plenty of panacea waiting for you, and the cultivation base that you have swallowed is much faster than your hard work." Yeluo was probably doing whatever he wanted to do, wishing that Mu Qinglan could be worse than her noble nanny. Who doesn't know that relying on pills to improve one's cultivation base is not only unstable, but also extremely easy to go crazy. The accumulation of toxins she ate herself might have poisoned her heart, so she actually wanted Mu Qinglan to follow the same path as her. Miss sent a message with a spirit bird yesterday to inquire about the progress. Yeluo lowered his voice and moved closer to Mu Qinglan. He couldn't exert pressure, so he wanted to use her bluish face to oppress Mu Qinglan and scare her. "Don't worry. Meditate in the yard all day, doing useless work." Yeluo said menacingly, "Your mother's life is miserable, and she is still waiting for you to go back. As long as Ms. Mu succeeds and wins the favor of the eldest lady, do you still worry about her status in the family in the future?" Mu Qinglan wiped her mouth clean, raised her eyes to look at Yeluo, "Thinking that my mother's life is suffering?" Mu Qinglan couldn't help but laugh because of Yeluo's threat. She thought of the one who pretended to be her mother and acted in a bitter scene. The one who felt really miserable was probably the one who was serving her now. But Mu Qinglan didn't say a word, she pretended to be useless, and played her cowardly little fish without distraction. "Now is not the time to tear yourself apart. Mu Wanran wants a person with such a low cultivation level to steal Tian Yuan Sword Sect's superb magic weapon, it is definitely not the ultimate goal." Mu Qinglan guessed that Mu Wanran had other conspiracy, otherwise she would not let her nanny follow her up the mountain, so she had to follow her plan and investigate further. Moreover, Mu Qinglan's current goal does not conflict with the task Mu Wanran assigned her to get close to Huoju as soon as possible. So Mu Qinglan lowered her head and muttered, "I'll go see you tomorrow, tomorrow. I will definitely complete the task as soon as possible." She must keep an eye on Yeluo to see what she is doing with her on this mountain. Seeing Mu Qinglan's cowardly and timid look as usual, Yeluo thought that she was afraid of mentioning her ugly mother. So the next day, Mu Qinglan begged to see Huoju again. It's been 4 days since she got married, and Huoju still refuses to see her, otherwise she wouldn't have made such a bad move. This early in the morning, she stood outside the cedar courtyard for a long time. When that idiot Chu Shuang came out, he still insisted on letting her go. "Miss Mu, with all due respect, you and the young master have never been married, but..." Chu Shuang paused, looked at Yeluo and the other two maids beside Mu Qinglan, and stopped talking. Chu Shuang really felt that the young lady of the Mu family didn't know how to live or die. She had been in Sushuan Pavilion for 4 days, and the puppet gu must have been suppressed. If she has any brains, she should know that leaving is the best thing. If the Tianyuan sword sect who stays here is really using the magic weapon, what will happen? But this Miss Mu has no intention of leaving at all. It seems that she is not only controlled by the gu insects, but also wants to steal the magic weapon of the school herself. There is no one available in the gate now. The 2 elders and the guards stationed by the imperial court are all watching. 2 days ago, there was another incident of a cocoon soul cultivator descending. It really couldn't be more chaotic. At this time, Chu Shuang was not in the mood to deal with this ignorant Miss Mu family. With a tiger's face, he said, "It's okay to invite Miss Mu to go back, or go down the mountain. Things are heavy in the door, and the young master is exhausted and sick in bed. I can't meet Miss Mu." Mu Qinglan stared in the direction of Suezong Yuan, and Chu Shuang said so seriously, "She didn't care at all, she just worried. Huo Lang, is he sick again?" "Yes." Chu Shuang prevaricated, "Please also invite Miss Mu to go back." Mu Qinglan had no choice but to take her back with her, feeling extremely worried. Back at Sushuan Pavilion, Yeluo advised Mu Qinglan, "There are not many disciples in Suezong Yuan, why don't you just keep an eye on Chu Shuang and break in when Chu Shuang is not around? Anyway, you are Huo Ju's nominal wife. Who can blame you when he sees his eagerness? Besides, Huo Ju is already a useless person. You can it away. We will go down the mountain immediately." When Yeluo said this, he suddenly felt cold all over. Mu Qinglan looked at her with a smile, and in the blink of an eye, she had thought of no less than a dozen ways to make Yeluo get rid of her. What Yeluo said is right. Huo Ju is in such a situation surrounded by enemies, he himself can't even move, he can't see things, isn't he letting others bully him? But how could Mu Qinglan bully Huo Ju? She wanted to pursue him. With Huo Ju's naturally cold personality, he is jealous of evil. If she dares to do evil, Huo Ju will definitely not like her. She managed to find ways to come to Cedar Mountain, and she must not ruin this excellent opportunity. When the 2 of them cooked rice, it would be better to have a big belly after cooking a few more times. Huo Ju is so responsible, even if he knew her by then, he would just hide her in embarrassment. Mu Qinglan trembled slightly with excitement at the thought of being hidden by him. Will he tie himself up by then? He will definitely say with a cold face, "Don't run around, I will protect you." Yeluo saw that Mu Qinglan's smile became more and more weird, rubbed her arms, frowned and said, "What are you laughing at?" Mu Qinglan's beautiful plans were shattered, and she regained her composure and restrained her emotions. Rura weakly said, "Don't worry, I'll stand outside the cedar courtyard later, the master is soft-hearted, if I stand more, he might see me." Yeluo was annoyed by Mu Qinglan's cowardice, but she didn't force Mu Qinglan to break into the cedar court. In the evening, Mu Qinglan really went to stand outside the Suezong courtyard again. She changed into a light blue jacket, with black hair like a waterfall and lips like vermilion fruit. Standing outside the desolate and cold cedar courtyard, she looked like a spring feeling that had strayed into winter. She was standing outside begging for an audience. Chu Shuang was very annoying, and the young master hadn't been able to figure out a rule to avoid being sent down by the spirit all day. As a result, Miss Mu's wolfish ambition to steal the magic weapon was not concealed. What should I do? Her puppet should be suppressed. Sushuan Pavilion's formations are all good, Chu Shuang asked Huo Ju, but she refuses to go down the mountain. The young master is not married to her, so she forced her to marry her. If I stay here, I still want to see you, it must be a big picture. Huo Ju was silent, his stomach hurts. To be precise, it is the pain in the lingfu. Pain is already normal, and since the shattering of the lingfu, he has been enduring this kind of pain all the time. But, 2 days ago, because he was fed with something, his spiritual power froze in the inner palace for a short time, suppressing the pain. But his inner mansion couldn't retain the spiritual power after all, it had already dissipated slowly, and the pain returned naturally. Huoju's face was pale and covered with veil, like a jade mountain about to collapse. It took a long time before he said, "No, see, please go back." After a pause, he continued, "Let the disciple avoid her maid in private, and give her the medicine to suppress the puppet voodoo." Huoju was already at this point, and he couldn't take care of himself. He could still think that Mu Qinglan was probably coerced and threatened by the maid, so she didn't go down the mountain, and the puppet goo was suppressed, so she didn't solve it completely. I think she was afraid. When Chu Shuang was about to go out, she moved her pale lips, and Zhou Chuan ordered, "If she is willing to go down the mountain, send 2 disciples to lead her to ride a horse with the wind, and her down the mountain." But there are not many disciples available in the courtyard, and there are only a few Yufeng horses left. Chu Shuang said, "Young master, we can't take care of ourselves now." Huoju turned his head to Chu Shuang's direction, frowned slightly. Chu Shuang immediately shut up, and led the order to send Mu Qinglan away from the courtyard. Mu Qinglan obediently went back to Sushuan Pavilion, and then ran back outside the cedar courtyard in the middle of the night. She can't force her way in, it will arouse the guard of the disciples, and she can no longer possess the disciples of the cedar courtyard. Huoju will worry about the safety of the disciples, and will try to fight her again. After thinking about it, Mu Qinglan quietly stuck to the big cedar tree outside Huoju's window, then concealed her breath, and blended in completely. At the same time, the cedar tree roots that took root deep below were quietly urged to crawl under Huoju's house. Mu Qinglan was really worried about Huoju's health. Knowing that he was in pain, she had a way to relieve his pain, so she thought of a wonderful way. She urged the roots to quietly climb from the ground and the window to Huoju's house. After a tree root pierced the window, she saw Huoju sleeping. He frowned, looking very uneasy. Mu Qinglan's distressed tree roots trembled. Because the roots of the cedar tree she manipulated have grown in Cedar Mountain for many years, and they have long been integrated with the formation of the cedar courtyard, and the breath is not repulsive, so she successfully broke through the formation set up by Huoju in the house. Then, rustling, broke out of the ground, and crawled to Huoju's bed from all directions. A green vine was exposed among a group of tree roots, and the room was filled with the fragrance of grass and trees. In his sleep, Huoju, whose 5 senses faded and was not as good as ordinary people, did not wake up. Mu Qinglan pretended to be clever, and brought the vine close to Huoju's lips. Then manipulated the vine to fold, and the crystal clear green juice dripped in along the slit of Huoju's lips. She also thought it was safe to do so. But the entrance of the cold and fragrant juice may wake up the farmer who died of sleep, especially Huoju's inner palace is in severe pain, and it is already a luxury to be able to take a nap for a while. He flung his eyes open but could see nothing. The strong fragrance of plants and trees in the air made Huoju immediately realize that person is here again. It was rare for Huoju this time, and he didn't have any creepy fear. Probably because he planned to put all his eggs in one basket and burn everything, but the other party was not upset when he was injured, so he made cakes for him. Anyway, Huoju was about to stand up with his arms propped up, and had a good chat with this mysterious person, asking him about his real purpose. As a result, Mu Qinglan, who had turned into tree roots and vines, seed that Huoju had woken up, and immediately panicked. Huoju grew up in Xianshan, and inherited the orthodoxy of Xianmen. Huoju should hate this kind of inhuman method the most. Mu Qinglan wanted to run subconsciously, but she hadn't relieved Huoju's pain yet, so she couldn't just leave like this. The way he fell asleep was so distressing. Mu Qinglan simply did nothing and kept going. Manipulating the vines, he quickly climbed onto the bed, tied Huoju's hands, feet and even his neck from the 4 corners, and pulled him back onto the bed tightly. In the blink of an eye, Huoju, whose limbs were stretched and tied up. What the is this? Mu Qinglan also knew that her way was too bad, and she complained in her heart that Huoju didn't see her. He had gotten along well with her earlier, and the double cultivation of the two of them would have stabilized his inner mansion, but in the end, she had to be forced to make such a bad move. With the idea of a quick fix, Mu Qinglan strangled the green, juicy vine directly into Huoju's mouth, forcing him to drink. Huoju's white veil fell off his face, and he stared into his big grey eyes, terrified. And his pale face turned from embarrassment after a long absence. After being tied up, Huoju touched the thick and wet tree roots with his fingers, and immediately thought of a monster, a tree demon. Although Huoju is a gentleman with the same appearance, he is not a fool who doesn't know anything. He has only seen a mortal man by a tree demon to blood in the cave of the tree demon that he had exterminated. Those men were all sucked like dead wood, but they were still kept alive by the tree demon. At that time, the disciples that Huoju brought to train had subdued the tree demon, but after those people were rescued, they couldn't bring them out of the mountain. Because their bones and blood have grown together with the big tree, and if the vines rooted in their bodies are broken, they will quickly shrivel up and die like plants that have lost their roots. Moreover, the tree demon turned into a woman and was happy with them every day. After being rescued, some of them who had just been captured could recover after being warmed up for a while, but they refused to leave hysterically. They also said that Huoju and the others had killed his beloved lady. Said that he had never had such a comfortable life in his life. That was the first time Huoju knew that a monster other than a vixen that sucked human essence and blood could be a tree. In the end, Huoju cruelly told the man that his good lady had captured more than one man, and she sucked them dry to make fertilizer, and the dryad had no gender at all, not even a woman, and they all transformed according to men's preferences. Phantom. The man was still obsessed with his obsession, and in the end Huoju slapped the heart-clearing spell on the Lingtai. Only then did he see clearly the fact that the beautiful lady he had been in love with every day was a bunch of withered vines. Huoju's heart was turbulent. He thought of the fragrance of plants and trees that he smelled these days, and of Chu Shuang who was occupied but not injured, and he seemed to have a strong cultivation base, but he didn't the magic weapon. Pestering his superior. Immediately, his face became red as if splashed with blood. Could it be that he met the same lewd and evil tree demon as when he was practicing? But there are many formations on this cedar mountain. How can monsters penetrate the formations and enter the mountain to do evil? Furthermore, the cedar courtyard where Huoju lived was also covered with countless exquisite formations, all of which were from the hands of Huo Yuanfei, the former head of the Tianyuan sword sect, and they were by no means ordinary formations. If there is a tree demon who can treat this array of formations as nothing, what kind of powerful evil thing must it be? And Huoju was wrong on second thought. The Tianyuan sword sect proves the Dao by slaying demons and eliminating demons. If any monsters dared to enter the mountain, they would have been crushed by the wind formation. Only when the spirit heavily injures the formation can it come and go freely. Could there be a monster more powerful than the demon cultivator in the violent spirit realm? Huoju's mouth was full of sweet and fragrant juice, he was forced to swallow it, and the inner palace and meridians were all warm and comfortable. He quickly denied the assumption that the other party was a dryad. Back then, he took his disciples to practice and subdued the tree demon. Because the tree demon sucked the blood essence of mortals, it was like a Buddha who had broken the precepts. From then on, it will no longer be able to absorb the essence of heaven and earth for its own use. Therefore, in the tree demon's cave, there is a smell of decaying corpses and rotten tree roots. All the bloodthirsty monsters have the same stinky smell. But the juice that Huoju swallowed and the scent of vegetation floating in the house were too fragrant and pure. There is even a kind of rosin that Huoju has smelled since he was a child, which belongs to the wilderness on the North Songshan mountain. It has to be said that Huoju felt relieved when he thought of this. At least he didn't have to be humiliated by monsters when he was about to die, otherwise Huoju would rather destroy himself than be a monster's nourishment. After thinking about this, his inner palace and mood calmed down a little, and the vines tied around his limbs were loosened rustlingly. Huoju was lying on the bed, and when he heard the receding tree roots, he even closed his window thoughtfully, and before walking towards the receding tree roots underground, he hooked the quilt over him. Huoju didn't know what expression to use to face this situation. His brows were tightly furrowed, his grey eyes stared in the dark, and he stayed up all night. On the other hand, Mu Qinglan, she turned into a tree root, stuck to the bottom of the bed silently, separated by a bed board, and stuck to Huoju all night. Before dawn the next day, he dissipated contentedly and returned to his Sushuan pavilion. Then, she dressed up again and ran to stand outside the cedar courtyard to beg to see her. Although it was posted all night last night, Mu Qinglan still wanted to see Huoju in human form. Mu Qinglan knew that if she had to accept Huoju's temperament, she could only accept the pursuit of a person, not anything else. Mu Qinglan has quietly observed Huoju for many years, and he is racist. So today she changed into a bright moon-white dress and wore a set of spirit hairpins, which was specially requested by the Mu family when she was forced to agree to marry as a substitute. Although Huoju can't see it now, Mu Qinglan firmly believes that as long as Huoju agrees to be with her and the two of them practice more frequently, he will be able to see it sooner or later. Hey, as long as they get married, Mu Qinglan can directly claim to be his wife, and then ask him to pay the public rations, so it's natural for both of them to cultivate. But Huoju refused to visit her, and if he didn't see her, he could only follow the usual practice, first capture his heart, and then practice double cultivation with him 180 times, put him into a deep sleep, and then coax him into marriage. It's a little troublesome, but Mu Qinglan thinks it's pretty good. Huo Lang is worth it. She waited outside the cedar courtyard, asked the little disciple to go in and report, and then waited outside with high expectations. Huoju's condition is very good today, he doesn't feel pain anywhere, but his expression looks a little depressed. He thought about it all night, but he couldn't figure out what was going on. He even thought that the pine tree in Cedar Mountain had grown into a spirit. Early in the morning, he asked Chu Shuang to take a magic weapon to test the big pine tree in his yard. There was no abnormal spiritual power reaction, just a pine tree that was not young. Huoju was already stubborn, and kept thinking about it when he couldn't figure it out. He didn't eat 2 bites in the morning, and sat by the window with frowns. Early in the morning, Chu Shuang was called by Elder Xiaolo to go to the elder's court, and the young disciple guarding the gate outside the Xuezong court came to report, "Sect leader, Miss Mu, please see me." Huoju didn't respond, and sat silently by the window. Thinking about the current situation of the Yuan sword sect in his mind, Elder Xiaolo asked Chu Shuang to go over. It should be that Elder Xiaolo couldn't pretend anymore, so Huoju had to try to call his senior sister back immediately. After all, the senior sister is the daughter that Elder Xiaolo loves the most. The daughter doesn't want to betray the sect because of robbing the magic weapon. No matter how ambitious the father is, he has to be cautious. At least the senior sister is here, and Elder Xiaolo will not forcefully take the magic weapon. Huoju ignored what the little disciple said, Miss Mu's request to see him, but asked his disciple to send him spiritual power, borrowed the spiritual power to transform into a spirit bird, and said to the spirit bird, "Senior sister, come back quickly." The spirit bird recorded Huoju's words, fluttered its wings and flew away from the window. After leaving the cedar courtyard, Mu Qinglan caught her and pinned her to the big pine tree. Mu Qinglan stood outside the cedar courtyard, seemingly motionless like a bastard, but in fact, she had already bent over the big pine tree, tinkering with the spirit bird for a long time. Thinking that the bird was made by Huoju, Mu Qinglan tied it with a few branches, poked it, and the spirit bird said, "Senior sister, come back quickly." One poke, and the spirit bird repeats itself. Mu Qinglan thought that Huoju's voice was very pleasant, and after playing for a while, the spirit bird almost disappeared. Only then did some spiritual energy be poured into it to maintain it, and then reluctantly let the spirit bird go. At this time, the little disciple guarding the gate was sent by Huoju to call Chu Shuang back. Elder Zaiolo wooed Chu Shuang several times. Chu Shuang couldn't possibly betray Huoju, but Elder Zaiolo was the father of the senior sister after all, so he couldn't tear himself apart. It was very embarrassing. Huoju sent someone to call for Chu Shuang to get out as soon as possible. The little disciple who took the order hurriedly left from the main gate to Zaiolo elder's home. He was told by the young master to use all his words in his head. He was afraid that if he forgot, he would not be able to bring Chu Shuang back successfully, and he would forget Mu Qinglan at all. Up! Mu Qinglan watched him hurry past her, opened her mouth, but still didn't ask anything. The little disciple was in a hurry, and it looked like he was going to do what Huoju had asked him to do, so she didn't follow her to make trouble. The disciples guarding the gate are now empty. The guards of the cedar courtyard are not very strict. The main reason is that there are many formations, and it is difficult to enter without a secret rune order. Seeing that there was no one at the gate of cedar courtyard, Yeluo got the news that Chu Shuang was not in the yard at all in the morning. She began to encourage Mu Qinglan. The specific method was to push Mu Qinglan to the yard directly, and said, "Go in. Chu Shuang is with Elder Zaiolu, and there is no one guarding the yard now. This is your chance." Mu Qinglan was staggered by the push, and looked back at Yeluo with sharp eyes. How did she know that Chu Shuang went to Elder Zaiolu early in the morning? There are people from her in this mountain, or people from the Mu family, and the news is quite well informed. Mu Qinglan thought for a while, lowered her eyes, and murmured, "But the young master didn't let me in. He didn't send anyone to tell you not to go in." Yeluo said, "Don't you want to see your mother earlier? Don't you want to go down the mountain earlier, so that you can find a new family? If you go down the mountain too late, even if we can testify to you that you didn't marry this young master of the Tianyuan sword sect, and no one believes it anymore. You should finish the task assigned by the eldest lady and go down the mountain. At that time, the eldest lady will find you a good family friend to be your husband, so that she can speak for you." Yeluo thinks that she has pinpointed Mu Qinglan's weakness very precisely. One is her mother, and the other is that no one would want to be married to a who has a broken soul and no tomorrow. Sure enough, after she finished speaking, Mu Qinglan lowered her head and walked into the Shuezong courtyard. Thinking of something, Yeluo hurriedly followed behind, leaned close to Mu Qinglan's ear, and said in a low voice, "The important items are not placed next to you, look beside the bed." Mu Qinglan nodded. She felt that what Yeluo said was reasonable. Huoju didn't let her in, so didn't he ask someone to let her go this time? She just went in to take a look, just to take a look. It would be even better if she could get close he. Anyway, if she doesn't speak, Huoju doesn't know who she is. After figuring it out, Mu Qinglan strode towards the inside. The secret runes that could stop monks had no effect on her. Every time she entered the formation, she would become invisible, and then be able to merge with the spiritual mist in the mountain. Get in without a hitch. Of course, Mu Qinglan didn't just want to look at Huoju, she also wanted to see who was next to Huoju who betrayed him. Even the traces of Chu Shuang and the location of the magic weapon placed next to her were exposed. This disciple has to be dealt with. Mu Qinglan walked in ostentatiously. There were not many disciples guarding the courtyard. She blurred her figure, walked around a few disciples, and locked on to the target. This target smelled of Mu Qinglan's imprint on Yeluo. This person must have had contact with Yeluo in private. Mu Qinglan identified the person who betrayed Huoju, and went to Huoju's room with ease. The door of Huoju's room was open, and at the door, he was seen sitting by the window, bathed in dry sunlight. His skin is as white as jade, and he looks pretty good today. The eyes are covered with white gauze, which is tied behind the head, the long hair is neatly half-tied, and there is a crown on the head. He was wearing the uniform of a disciple of the Tianyuan sword sect. The base coat was pure white as snow and embroidered with cedar with gold thread coils. Mu Qinglan could tell at a glance that there was a protective formation on it, which was a high-grade protective robe. As the saying goes, if you want to be pretty, you should be filial. Huoju looked extremely good today, infinitely close to the glimpse Mu Qinglan had had at Mu's house. If it weren't for the lack of an épée on his back, he would still be the young fairy who was born in a days back then. It's just that his figure has lost a lot of weight, and his brows are slightly frowned, as if there is some unresolved sorrow. Mu Qinglan stepped lightly, sneaked in and walked into the room. But, how can desire be easily satisfied? At first Mu Qinglan just wanted to take a look at it from a distance. Then she thought about taking a closer look. When Mu Qinglan entered the house, Huoju only regarded it as a disciple who entered the house to tidy up, and did not respond. Mu Qinglan turned around twice, and really tidied up the room briefly, mainly Huoju's clothes and supplies, and by the way, put a worn coat of Huoju into the storage bag. But after tidying things up, Mu Qinglan was not satisfied with looking at Huoju like this, so she moved closer to Huoju, and then Huoju finally asked, "What's the matter?" He didn't know which inner court disciple was in the room. Mu Qinglan didn't speak, and stood in front of Huoju, knowing that she should go, but she couldn't move. She fixedly looked at the vertical lines between Huoju's eyebrows, and stretched out her fingers, trying to smooth them out. In places like the center of the eyebrows, even with a broken spiritual mansion, it is impossible not to feel that someone wants to touch it. Before Mu Qinglan touched him, Huoju reached out and grabbed Mu Qinglan. He frowned, and wanted to reprimand and let the disciple go out, but when he caught it, he was shocked and raised his head slightly. "This hand is too soft and slender, it is not a man's hand at all. Who are you? How did you get in here?" Huoju questioned repeatedly, grabbing Mu Qinglan's paw that was trying to commit crimes with one hand, while the other hand was already covered by the sleeve of his robe, and he went to the storage bag to touch the talisman. Mu Qinglan was really flustered, mainly because she swaggered into Huoju's room right now, easily exposing the fact that she came and went freely. Originally, when the Mu family and the Tianyuan sword sect got engaged, in the betrothal gift that the Tianyuan sword sect sent to the Mu family, there was a jade pendant, which was a rune jade that could pass through all the formations of the Tianyuan sword sect. This is also easy to understand. If Mu Wanran, the eldest lady of the Mu family, really married into the Tianyuan sword sect, then she would be the wife of the young master, and naturally belong to the Tianyuan sword sect, so she can go anywhere. Before Mu Qinglan agreed to marry as a substitute, she asked Mu Wanran for the rune jade. Mu Wanran had bad intentions and refused to marry anyone, but she refused to give the rune jade to Mu Qinglan. In a fit of anger, Mu Qinglan sneaked into Mu Wanran's room and destroyed the jade pendant. So now that Mu Qinglan was caught by Huoju on the spot, she didn't even have an excuse. She couldn't explain how she passed through the formations and how she bypassed the guarding disciples to get in. Mu Qinglan panicked and wanted to break away from Huoju and slip away. But looking at Huoju's shocked and furious eyebrows, she felt that his whole body was alive. Mu Qinglan was even terrified, thinking that Huoju couldn't see anyway, so why don't she take a bite and run away? Feasible. Mu Qinglan always moves faster than her mind. She quickly approached Huoju, searched his face, and selected Huoju's brow with a more restrained manner. Huoju sensed Mu Qinglan's approach, and the hand that didn't let go of Mu Qinglan squeezed her tightly to prevent her from running away. The other hand took out a talisman to mobilize the broken Lingfu, and when Mu Qinglan approached, when it came to his face, he raised his hand very accurately and made a pop. The talisman was pasted on Mu Qinglan's smooth forehead full of unhealthy thoughts. Huoju's brows were frosty, eyes narrowed slightly, waiting for the talisman to take effect. If he had not guessed wrongly, the talisman was directly pasted on the opponent's altar. No matter who it was, they might not be able to withstand the blast of the talisman bursting. This directly stirred the Lingtai. But after waiting for 2 breaths, nothing happened. Huoju is a dummy. Mu Qinglan, who was about to go all out and get bombed. So the blind man is fine. What kind of talisman do you draw? It's better if it doesn't work like this, but what if it blows itself up as soon as you push it? Mu Qinglan raised her hand to peel off the talisman, folded it with one hand, and put it directly into the storage bag. If it was broken, it was also written by Huo Lang. On the contrary, Mu Qinglan left in no hurry, and continued to observe Huo Ju's complexion closely. He frowned slightly, although he couldn't see his eyes, he could tell that he was anxious. Huo Ju was indeed in a hurry. The spiritual power activated by this talisman seal is only a tiny wisp, but Huo Ju's spiritual mansion has been turned upside down. He will never be able to mobilize his spiritual power by himself. He has no other way to defend against the enemy other than activating the talisman. The opponent does not know who it is, and the origin is unknown. Apart from Huo Ju's senior sister Duan Qingxuan and the lady of the canteen of the Tianyuan Sword School, Bai Songshan has no women at all. It's not that Huo Ju never thought that Duan Qingxuan would come back early to tease him. But this woman's fingers are slender and her skin is as thick as fat. She is definitely not Duan Qingxuan who has been practicing épée all year round. Huo Ju didn't think about Mu Qinglan at all, or he didn't think she had the ability to break in at all, so he didn't pay attention to Mu Qinglan, a puppet of the Mu family. Just assume that this is another person who covets the magic weapon in the door, and somehow got in. Huo Ju moved his lips, wanting to call his disciples, but soon he pressed his lips tightly together again. Most of the disciples in his courtyard are not good at cultivation, and those who are higher have gone to another school. This woman can touch his room, and it seems that her cultivation is not shallow. Huo Ju can't harm the disciples. He only thought about it for a while, and then gave up asking for help. Anyway, he was dying, and the other party wanted the magic weapon, he would definitely not be able to find it. Therefore, Huo Ju didn't do anything other than holding Mu Qinglan's hand. The two stood next to each other, and neither of them spoke for a short period of time. Their shadows were reflected on the ground by the sunlight outside the window, and there was an indescribable warmth and harmony for a while. Of course, if they didn't have their own ghosts so that they were about to give birth. Huo Ju endured the pain like being stabbed by a knife, and crazily mobilized the spiritual power in his body. He had already broken his spiritual mansion, and mobilizing his spiritual power was like fetching water from a bamboo basket. But he didn't give up easily, he slowly condensed a small strand in the meridian, and then pushed it towards the palm of his hand. Huo Ju thought, if he moved another talisman, he might be able to force the opponent back. He still refuses to admit defeat, and blames himself for not drawing talismans with his eyes closed before. The talismans didn't work, and it fell into such a situation. And Mu Qinglan thought he has moved the Lingfu again. Mu Qinglan was anxious, but she didn't dare to suppress the Lingfu for Huo Ju at this time. Seeing Huo Ju stubbornly mobilizing his spiritual power, she sighed slightly. Forget it, Huo Ju has a strong temper, and he has the courage to fight back after being crippled like this. What if he feels humiliated after being bitten by her, and he can't think about committing suicide anymore? Of course, Mu Qinglan could break away from Huo Ju and run away, but Huo Ju's way of sitting by the window and worrying deeply made Mu Qinglan give up the idea of leaving. Of course, the most important thing is that she is also reluctant to let Huo Ju let go of her hand. He took her hand. In the mortal world, if you hold hands, you will be destined for life. A layer of crimson gradually appeared on Mu Qinglan's face, she was genuinely shy. Huo Ju is so strong, he hurt her so much. Mu Qinglan couldn't help but said, Huo Lang, be gentle. Huo Ju was concentrating his spiritual power, but he didn't expect the person being caught to speak suddenly. He was so startled that the spiritual power he had gathered so easily disappeared without a trace, and he let go of his hand. How could Mu Qinglan let Huo Ju let go? She hasn't caught enough yet. Mu Qinglan grabbed Huo Ju's hand with her backhand, and then covered the back of her hand again. Catch it, I'm here with you. Huoju's fine hair stood up all the way from the tailbone to the Tianling cover. He asked again, "Who are you?" "I'm your newly married wife." Mu Qinglan approached Huoju, squatted beside him, clamped Huoju's hand with both hands, and gently stroked it. The voice was soft enough to pinch water. "My name is Mu Qinglan." Huoju frowned fiercely, but soon returned to normal. He didn't believe what Mu Qinglan said at all, but he had to calm down and deal with this person. Huoju didn't speak. Now that Mu Qinglan had revealed her identity, she let it go and asked what she always wanted to ask: "Why didn't you see me? Do you want to regret the marriage?" Huoju withdrew his hand again. Mu Qinglan was very sorry, but this time she didn't grab him again. Huoju turned his head slightly, looking for Mu Qinglan's direction. Mu Qinglan looked at Huoju's slender hands that were pressed on her knees. Without touching them, she tapped Huoju's knees lightly through the robe, and said, "I'm here, squatting." Huoju lowered his face, as if he was looking at Mu Qinglan. "I have no intention of getting married." Huoju said, "You are not the candidate for the vow." When Mu Qinglan heard this, Huoju really wanted to go back on his word. She wasn't annoyed. Huoju was sitting in front of her, and he couldn't run away. Mu Qinglan was in no hurry to pursue someone. She thought for a while and said, "Have you met Mu Wanran, the eldest lady of the Mu family? I am prettier than her." Huoju. Mu Qinglan said, "The eyes are bigger than hers, the skin is better than hers, the legs are longer than hers, and she is even taller than hers. Everyone who has met me says I'm pretty, really. If you don't believe me, touch it." Mu Qinglan finally found an excuse to grab Huoju's hands, but she still grabbed both of them, and pressed her face when she grabbed them. "You can't see, you can feel the bones, you know how to feel the bones, my nose bridge, among this person, is Wang Fu's long-lived good looks." Huoju's hand was pressed stiffly, and he walked slowly on Mu Qinglan's face. He could touch it a little, but, the key is that this person is really the puppet of the Mu family? How did he break through the magic circle and come to him at the initial stage of shattering illusion realm? Huoju didn't shy away from refusing. Although he didn't believe what Mu Qinglan said, he could at least feel the subtle differences in the bones of monsters and humans. "She is human." Huoju was so thoughtful. He let Mu Qinglan play with his hands for a while, and naturally he didn't notice that Mu Qinglan secretly rubbed his lips against his fingers under the guise of touching his bones. Mu Qinglan is still sparing no effort to promote herself. "Touch it, this pointed chin, this neck is comparable to a crane, right?" Mu Qinglan brought Huoju's hands down, and when she saw that she was about to go up the mountain, Huoju suddenly withdrew her hands. Shen Sheng asked with some coldness, "How did you get in? What about the disciples outside? How did you break through the magic circle? Did the Mu family give you a rune jade pendant?" A series of 4 indifferent questions dampened Wang Po's enthusiasm for selling melons. Mu Qinglan also replied to Huoju's question, saying, "He came in with a disciple, and I don't have a jade pendant. He waited for the disciple's eye escape to set up for me." "Who is it?" This time, Mu Qinglan didn't answer. She just planted the disciple who had a relationship with Yeluo and secretly betrayed Huoju, but she didn't know the name of the disciple. Mu Qinglan only said, "Anyway, I've already married you, so you can't go back on your word. You don't still think about Miss Mu, do you?" Mu Qinglan shook her head and said, "Don't think about her, let me tell you, I saw her secretly raising a merman in the backyard, a male, golden red, and she was in the water with that merman. It's so embarrassing." Mu Qinglan touched her hot cheek and said, "Anyway, she doesn't like you, so don't miss her." Huoju, Mu Wan secretly raised sharks in the yard. "Yet, that shark looks pretty, she must like to go there all day." Huoju was lost in thought. Mu Qinglan saw that his face was different, and said quickly, "Of course. The shark is definitely not comparable to you. He is not as good looking as you, and his body is still in tatters. I guess he was thrown away by someone and picked up by the eldest lady. Yes. People who are not of my race will have a different heart. Don't worry, I'm the same as you. What kind of racial discrimination? Huoju's eyes behind the white gauze narrowed slightly. This was something he didn't know. He didn't care about the remorse of the Mu family's marriage. The head of the Mu family, Huo Yuanfei, took advantage of Huoju's downhill training to make his own decisions. Huoju and the young lady of the Mu family only met once. But if the Miss Mu family hides the Mareman secretly, she won't know anything about the evil cultivators of the monster clan. This is useful news for Huoju. He didn't say anything for a while. Mu Qinglan waited and saw that he didn't speak. She grabbed his hand again and shook it. Said, "So Huo Lang, when will we make up the worship hall? You haven't lifted my hijab yet, and I keep all the hijabs." Huoju faced her with a serious face, not knowing what to say. He had already confirmed that the person in front of him was indeed Mu Qinglan. Didn't he say it clearly enough? He has no intention of getting married, not to mention that when he was good, he only focused on cultivation. As he is now, getting married is also a drag on others. He wondered if Chu Shuang hadn't asked his disciples to give Mu Qinglan away to suppress the puppet gu, so she didn't dare to go down the mountain. Mu Qinglan didn't wait for him to reply. She said again, "Okay, you don't have to go to church if you don't want to. You are not in good health, you really need to save your energy. How about, I'll move in to live with you tonight. Start double cultivation tonight, and he won't suffer any more." Huoju's "I'll give you the antidote" was directly dismissed by Mu Qinglan's violent words. His well-shaped and light-colored lips moved, and finally he only spit out two words absurdly, "What? What? Who do you live with?"